The air is thick with heat. You shuffle along a dry riverbed, cracked and ancient, the wind cutting low across the mudflats. It smells like salt and scorched time. In the distance, something looms massive, tiered, half swallowed by the desert. Not a mountain, not a pyramid. A ziggurat. The bones of a civilization that shouldn't have existed this early, shouldn't have known this much, shouldn't have built anything this clean. This is Sumer. And you probably won't survive this. Not physically, of course. You're tucked safely into your blankets, fan humming in the corner, maybe a tea cooling beside you. No, the part of you that won't survive is the one that believed history made sense, that it moved in straight lines from spear to plow to temple to internet. The part that thought civilization began slowly, one mistake at a time. That part, yeah. Sumer's about to break it, because the Sumerians didn't evolve. They arrived. No earlier drafts, no warm-up drawings, just bam. Cities, laws, timekeeping, math, bureaucracy, gods with job descriptions, priests with payrolls. It's as if someone booted up an ancient version of Windows and the login screen said, "Welcome to Uruk 1.0 Administrative Heaven." And then the first thing they did was start building a library. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. Now lean in. You'll want to be close for this one. These were people who charted the stars before the pyramids were even rumors, who invented writing not just to say hi, but to track goat rentals and temple donations, who spoke a language that connects to no other tongue on earth, who called themselves Sag-Giga, the blackheaded people, and made no effort to explain where they came from, who left behind king lists claiming their rulers reigned for 28,800 years, who remembered a time before the flood, and who may have forgotten something even bigger. Because this story, it doesn't unfold like a timeline. It spirals. Each tablet, each ruin, each cryptic phrase pulls you deeper into a civilization that looked in the mirror and didn't see a beginning, but a reboot. So post your location and local time in the comments. Let's see who else is wide awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering why no one ever told you the first civilization was this weird. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started on tonight's journey together. You're going to meet kings who ruled before the calendar, gods who created humans to avoid hard labor, structures that may have once summoned fire from the heavens, and systems so advanced we're still using them without even knowing where they came from. But don't worry, it's going to be relaxing. Probably. Close your eyes if you'd like. We're heading into the dust, back to the place where the first questions were asked and where no one liked the answers. Back to Sumer. You open your eyes to dust. Not the kind that dances lazily in morning light, but the heavy kind, dry, ancient, clinging to your lungs. It smells like heat, and old parchment, and maybe even like secrets. You're standing in a land older than myth, where the rivers groan and the wind carries syllables no one remembers how to speak. This is Mesopotamia, somewhere near the Euphrates. And buried under the grit, under layers of broken time, are people who weren't supposed to exist, not like this. Not all at once. They're called the Sumerians, and you didn't get here to understand them. You got here because no one else ever really has. See, history is supposed to progress slowly. First fire, then huts. Eventually, a few stone tools, followed by cave paintings of deer with really questionable anatomy. Civilization, we're told, is a slow burn, thousands of years of baby steps. But the Sumerians, They showed up like a glitch in the Matrix. Imagine you step outside one morning and suddenly your backyard is an entire alien city. There's a ziggurat where your tomato plants were. People are carving symbols into clay, arguing about property taxes, drafting laws, recording astronomical cycles, and making sacrifices to gods who are disturbingly well organized. No learning curve, no rough drafts, just boom. Civilization. And here's the twist, no one knows where they came from. There's no trace of a slow cultural buildup, no primitive Sumerian scribbles, no ancestral form of the language, just Sumerian. Fully baked, fully baffling. A language that connects to nothing else. No Indo-European roots, no Semitic branches. Just a linguistic orphan, standing alone in the storm, whispering to no one in particular. Linguists call it a language isolate, which is a fancy way of saying Kup sir balas kodisu gehispart gikarkis. That's already weird. But then you look at what they did with that language. They wrote, not graffiti, not name tags, actual writing. They invented cuneiform, one of the earliest known scripts, and used it for everything. Tax records, love poetry, war manifestos, epic myths that make Game of Thrones look like kindergarten nap time. These weren't doodlers. These were architects of memory. They encoded their entire world in lines and wedges, and somehow we're still trying to decipher the echoes. And that's just the alphabet soup. The Sumerians didn't just build cities. They built the idea of cities, urban centers with walls and markets and sewage systems, temples so massive they looked like stairways to heaven, bureaucracies that tracked every goat, every basket of grain, every offering to every god on every Tuesday. It's as if someone dropped the blueprint for advanced civilization in the middle of a Neolithic neighborhood and said, good luck, y'all. Their cities, Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, rose from the mudflats of southern Mesopotamia like ancient software installations already up and running. There's no trial version, no beta test, just full launch. And if you're thinking, maybe this is just what civilizations do, you'd be wrong. Nowhere else on Earth does civilization just detonate like this. Egypt took longer. The Indus Valley eased into it. China walked before it ran. But Sumer teleported in like it had somewhere else to be. Which brings us to the unsettling part. We don't know where they came from. Not really. The cultures that came before them, the Ubaid, the Samara, were building temples, yes, but they weren't writing legal codes. They weren't drafting king lists or inventing a lunar calendar or measuring land by rods and cords. Then somewhere between 3500 and 3100 BCE, something happened. The Ubaid fades, and suddenly there's Uruk, fully structured, heavily populated trading with distant lands. It's like history skipped a step. And here's the Sumerian cherry on top, even they didn't explain it. Their myths don't speak of long migrations or tribal conquests. They speak of appointments. The gods descended, handed out kingships like divine HR reps, and everyone got to work. That's it. No, we came from the mountains or we crossed the river. They didn't tell stories about their origins because apparently they didn't need to. They didn't see themselves as newcomers. They saw themselves as installed, which is about the point in the story where modern scholars start to twitch. Because when people talk about sudden appearances, about blueprints falling from the sky, about languages with no ancestors and knowledge that seems too advanced, they start sounding like that guy. The one who wears a lot of tinfoil and yells about Atlantis and aliens and gods from Nibiru. To be clear, we are not saying the Sumerians were ancient aliens. We're just saying they're weird. And the more you dig, the weirder they get. They called themselves Sag Giga, the black-headed people, which is either a reference to hair color, a spiritual metaphor, or a divine barcode. We'll get to that. But for now, picture them standing in the marshy heat of Mesopotamia, surrounded by reeds and ruins, speaking a language no one else has ever spoken, writing down laws about oxen and debt and temple duty, with the calm confidence of people who were born knowing the rules. And if you think we've hit peak mystery already, buckle up, because we haven't even gotten to the part where their kings ruled for 36,000 years. The black-headed people. That's what they called themselves, Sag Giga in Sumerian. Not children of the gods, not people of the two rivers, not even something catchy like lords of the Ziggurats. Just the black-headed people. And to this day, no one really knows why. At first glance, it sounds literal. You picture a civilization of dark-haired individuals baking under the Mesopotamian sun, tying their hair back with reeds, maybe twisting it into those odd, helmet-like wigs you see in ancient carvings. And sure, Sumerian art does often show men and women with deep black hair, usually in stylized curls or layered shapes. But here's the problem. Ancient cultures didn't usually define themselves by something as mundane as hair color. That's modern behavior. That's blondes have more fun energy, not I built the first writing system energy. In ancient times, identity was tied to land, to lineage, to language and blood and gods. You didn't call your people the brown-eyed folks. You were the sons of Enki, the tribe of the east wind, the stewards of sacred water. Something spiritual, something weighty. But the Sumerians chose black-headed. It's one of the most quietly bizarre acts of self-branding in all of human history. Not because it's inaccurate we assume they did have dark hair, but because it feels arbitrary. Why not the builders, the ziggurat makers, the ones who remember before the flood? Unless it wasn't about hair at all. Let's break it down. In Sumerian, Sag means head. Gig means black. But that little G-A at the end, that's where things get strange. It can imply possession or identity. So the phrase doesn't just mean people with black heads. It can also be interpreted as those whose identity is tied to black-headedness. And that makes things murkier. Black-headedness as identity. Now we're in deeper water. In the Sumerian worldview, color wasn't just visual, it was symbolic. Black wasn't a negative shade. It represented the fertile earth, the sacred soil of the floodplain, the clay from which humans were formed. In contrast, red soil came from the arid lands to the west dry-cracked lifeless. So maybe the Sumerians were saying, we are of the fertile earth. Maybe black-headed meant children of the sacred mud. Not a racial marker, but a spiritual lineage. After all, in one myth, the gods mold humans from clay. Not metaphorical clay, literal sticky riverbank sludge. Mix that with divine spit and voila, humankind. So perhaps black-headed is a poetic fossil from that myth, a leftover term from the day they named themselves after the raw materials of their birth. But if that's the case, why did the gods also use the term? See, it's not just the Sumerians calling themselves this. Their gods in the tablets used the same term, Sag Giga, in prayers, in hymns, and curses. Not humans, not mortals, just the black-headed. Now it gets darker. Because if a god calls you black-headed, it might not be flattery. It might be a designation, a label for a created class, a cosmic barcode. In Sumerian myth, the gods didn't create humans out of affection. They created them out of exhaustion. The junior gods, the Ig, had revolted. Too much labor. Too many canals to dig temples to build. So the elder gods had a boardroom meltdown and decided to make a replacement species. That's us, born out of a labor strike. The humans, according to the myth, were made to take over divine chores, farming, building, sacrificing, data entry. And when they succeeded, the gods referred to them not by name, not by tribe, but as Sag Giga, the blackheaded, the functional ones, the updated model, version 2.0 of cosmic labor. It starts to sound less like an identity and more like an asset tag. The humans worked. The system ran. The gods rested. And that makes the phrase feel eerie. Not like a declaration of pride, but a title of containment. You are black-headed because you are of the model that works. You're not chosen. You're authorized. You're not named. You're labeled. But what if we push it further? There are texts, rare fragmented, that suggest the gods tested different versions of humans. Some were flawed, too violent, too slow, missing parts. One account speaks of humans with no eyes, no mouth, or madness in the brain. These were discarded, scrapped. Only one prototype was deemed stable. Guess which one? The Sag Giga. So now, the phrase doesn't sound like a heritage. It sounds like a serial number. We, the black-headed, are the survivors. Not of an apocalypse, but of a divine R&D process. And in that context, the Sumerians calling themselves the black-headed people is not tribal pride. It's legacy, memory, trauma, the echo of their creation myth baked into identity. But even that might be too simple. Because in Sumerian art, the head was sacred, the seat of breath, of thought, of soul. It was often invoked in rituals. Some even wore elaborate headpieces during temple ceremonies. So maybe black-headed didn't refer to hair or clay, but to thought. Maybe it meant something deeper. The people of shadowed minds, the ones with complexity, free will, mystery, the ones even the gods couldn't fully predict, which is terrifying because now the phrase becomes loaded, not a sign of strength, but of danger. The black-headed are not the beloved. They are the anomaly, the ones who build cities in defiance, who invent writing to remember things they shouldn't, who raise towers toward heaven, who argue with gods, who break the rules of the game and get remembered anyway. The Sumerians may not have known exactly what the phrase meant, but they kept it, passed it down, carved it into clay, whispered it in temples, wrote it in their own prayers. We are the black-headed people, like a mantra, like a warning, like a secret they didn't dare forget. And maybe, just maybe, they didn't choose the name. Maybe it was given, not by a king, not by a priest, but by someone, something older. The ones who built the system, the ones who held the tablets, the ones who decided when to replace the gods with humans and never told them why. You are the black-headed. Now get back to work. You blink and the city is there, not slowly rising from generations of huts and goat pens not pieced together with the trial and error of rustic ancestors fumbling toward permanence, but they're fully formed. Uruk, streets paved, temples aligned with the stars, administrators already arguing about grain ratios, priests already chanting about divine mandates, bureaucracy humming like it's been running for centuries. That's the problem with Sumer. Civilizations are supposed to crawl out of the Stone Age. They're supposed to be a mess, at first scrappy, organic, half-failed experiments in group living. You get a few clay pots, a mud hut, maybe a well if you're lucky. But the Sumerians didn't crawl. They leapt. and the landing was suspiciously clean. One moment, there's a collection of Neolithic farming villages along the southern Mesopotamian floodplains. Quiet, simple, typical. And then there's Uruk. Boom. It's the 4th millennium BCE, and suddenly, this isn't farming. It's urbanism. You've got a population in the tens of thousands. You've got temples the size of football fields. You've got state-controlled labor forces, long-distance trade, centralized storage of grain, standardized accounting tablets and writing. Oh yeah, they invented writing. Cuneiform wasn't some gradual evolution from pictographs scratched on bark. It was a system, structured, repeatable, scalable. First, they used it to count barley, then to manage property, then to tell myths, list kings, and record laws. That's not just literacy. That's an operating system. And it didn't take them centuries to develop. It took decades. What happened? This is where most historians quietly change the subject, because there is no comfortable answer. There is no record of Proto-Uruk. There's no evidence of failed pre-cities. No earlier layers of cruder organization. There's just a sharp line between not Uruk and Uruk, and the timeline is unnervingly fast. So what fueled this explosion? Geography, maybe. Sumer sat between the Tigris and Euphrates, two unpredictable rivers, with tempers like caffeine-fueled toddlers. If you wanted to survive here, you had to get smart fast. Managing these rivers required irrigation canals, drainage systems, dams, reservoirs. You couldn't wing it. You had to engineer. You had to plan. And planning demands hierarchy. Priests, managers, scribes. A society with irrigation is a society with spreadsheets. So maybe that was the spark. Maybe necessity birthed complexity. But that doesn't explain the scale, because by the time Uruk was in full bloom, it wasn't just surviving, it was dominating. We're talking about a metropolis sprawling over 250 hectares, bigger than many medieval European cities, with zoning, administrative quarters, craft production centers, sacred precincts, residential blocks, all aligned, all intentional. That doesn't happen because a few farmers had a good season. That happens because someone had a blueprint. It gets stranger. Their economy wasn't based on coinage. It was based on redistribution. The temples collected resources, grain, textiles, livestock, and then allocated them back out. This required a dizzying level of record keeping. Who brought how much barley? Who got how many fish? Did the weaver's daughter collect her wool rations last week? Enter the scribes. Armed with styluses and soft clay, they turned the city into a ledger. These weren't idle scribbles. These were legal documents, contracts, formulas. You can still read some of them today. 2 goats for the temple of Inana delivered by Enmerkar's nephew, payment complete. That level of precision, that's civilization flexing its muscles. And it kept flexing. Sumerians developed systems of law, systems of weights and measures, systems of astronomy, and even a base 60 math system that we still use to divide hours and circles. Think about that. You're living in a digital world where seconds tick by in sexagesimal because of people who worshipped river gods and wrote in triangles. This wasn't trial and error. This was calculated. And it wasn't just what they built. It was how they thought about it. In myth, they didn't say they invented civilization. They said it was bestowed. There's this strange little story, half epic, half cosmic software update, where the god Enki gives the me to Inanna. The me aren't scrolls or stones. They're divine decrees, blueprints. They're the building blocks of society, kingship, law, warfare, music, prostitution, honesty, deceit. Yes, even lies have their own me. Inanna takes these gifts back to Uruk, and then boom, Uruk becomes the heart of civilization. That's how the Sumerians told it. Not we figured this out, but we received it. They didn't see themselves as inventors. They saw themselves as recipients, which is the kind of thing you say when your own rise feels too fast to explain. And maybe it was. Historians still debate whether the rise of Sumer was a unique accident of geography, social pressure, and pure human ingenuity, or whether it reflects something even older, a memory, a recovery. See, there's a quiet theory that Sumer wasn't the first civilization. It was the first to remember one, that the flood myths, the long-reigned kings, the stories of divine knowledge being handed down aren't metaphors, they're corrupted memories. That before Sumer, there was another world. One that rose, flourished, and fell. And that Sumer was the reboot, not the start of the story, but chapter 2. That's why there's no slow rise, no ramp up, just detonation. Because the pieces were already there, buried in time in broken cities, in forgotten languages. And Sumer just turned the system back on. Maybe that's why they obsessed over record keeping. They cataloged everything. Lists of kings, lists of gods, lists of lists. If you were alive in Sumer and you sneezed near a ziggurat, someone probably wrote it down. It wasn't compulsion. It was preservation. A collective promise we won't forget again. But they did. Eventually, the tablets crumbled, the canals dried, the cities collapsed, and the dust returned. But not before they planted seeds in the ground seeds of civilization that would spread to Babylon, to Persia, to Greece, to us. Seeds in the shape of writing, of measurement, of time itself. So when you look at your clock and see 60 seconds ticking by, when you count 12 hours on your wall, when you read this now in left to right format, parsing symbols as meaning, you're still living in Sumer. They erupted into existence and left a trail of blueprints in their wake. And if you listen carefully beneath the noise of your own world, you can still hear them murmuring. Not we were first, but we remembered. You're welcome. Okay, so let's say you're a newly formed civilization. You've got cities writing a working theocracy and a suspiciously advanced bureaucracy. You've even convinced a few skeptical gods to bless your grain offerings. What's next? Simple. You make a list. Not just any list. The Sumerian king list. It sounds modest. It is not. This clay tablet is on its surface a roll call of rulers' names, cities' reign lengths. The kind of thing you'd expect a diligent scribe to track for the sake of historical continuity and temple taxes. But then you get to the first few entries, and suddenly history screeches into myth like a chariot hitting a wall. The first king, Alulim. How long did he reign? Oh, just 28,800 years? Next up, Allogar. A cool 36,000 years. Then in Menluana, who held the throne for 43,200 years. That's more time than separates us from the Ice Age. And they weren't anomalies. The entire early portion of the king list, known as the antediluvian section, or before the flood, is packed with these impossible reigns. Hundreds of thousands of years of rule before the world was supposedly reset by divine deluge. What? There are a few ways you can react to this. The modern scholar's way is to gently clear your throat, push your glasses up the bridge of your nose, and say, well, these numbers are clearly symbolic. Sure. Symbolic of what exactly? Because these aren't just random giant numbers. They follow specific mathematical patterns, multiples of 60 elegant round figures that align suspiciously well with Mesopotamian numerical systems. This wasn't someone wildly guessing how old Grandpa Alulim might have been. This was intentional, so then you get the second approach. They were mythologizing history. Maybe these kings weren't literal humans, but gods, culture heroes, or semi-divine titans whose lengthy reigns symbolize their greatness. Okay. But why give them precise dates? Why 800? Why not just say a really long time? These are not poetic flourishes. These are accountancy numbers, like someone was keeping score. Now, the third possibility is weirder. Maybe they were remembering something. Not accurately, not clearly. But in the same way, a dream lingers after you wake up distorted and symbolic and just off. Maybe these kings, or whatever they were, weren't metaphors. Maybe they were something older, something pre-human. The last fragments of a time when time didn't quite work the same. And that's where the flood comes in, because halfway down the list, the tone shifts. A single line breaks the flow, then the flood swept over. Just that. No backstory, no explanation, no drama. Just flood. Civilization. Hard reset. After the flood reign lengths drop dramatically. No more tens of thousands of years. Now kings rule for 60, 30, 12 years. Suddenly, everything's mortal again, which is suspicious. The implication that the world before the flood ran on a different timeline. Or perhaps that the entities ruling back then weren't exactly human. Their reigns were longer because they were different. Less kings. More, let's say, custodians. Maybe Alulim didn't rule for 800 calendar years. Maybe he was 800 years. A system, a governing principle, a consciousness, a firmware, not a man, but an era. And if that's true, then the king list isn't just a political document. It's a data fragment from a corrupted archive, a list of operating systems that once ran reality. Sound crazy? Well, here's the part that makes it worse. The list doesn't blink. It reads the antediluvian kings with the same tone it uses to describe later ones like Gilgamesh, who, by the way, is on the list too. Yes, the semi-divine hero of the world's first great epic is listed as a king of Uruk, reigning for a measly 126 years. The king list doesn't distinguish between myth and history. It just scrolls, which means either the Sumerians didn't see a distinction, they did and chose not to show it, or they remembered things we don't, because this isn't the only place ancient civilizations describe exaggerated reigns before a flood. The Bible gives us Methuselah, who lived 969 years. The book of Enoch speaks of the Watcher's beings who descended from heaven and disrupted human affairs. Hindu cosmology talks about yugas, cosmic ages lasting hundreds of thousands of years. Greek mythology divides humanity into golden, silver, bronze, and iron ages, each one shorter, more flawed than the last. This idea that time used to be different and that we are living in the broken leftovers is everywhere. The Sumerian king list just writes it down like a ledger. And then comes the part that chills historians and mystics alike. The list continues. There's no. And then myth ends and real history begins. Just a gentle curve from impossible to plausible, from world-bending kings to real ones you can find in the archaeological record. It slides you from fantasy into fact without blinking. It's like walking through a museum and realizing the dragons are listed right before the pharaohs. So how do you read that? One theory is that the Sumerians were trying to encode everything they knew, history, myth, theology, memory, into one document. Not to explain the past, but to anchor it, to make sure none of it slipped away, even the parts that made no sense, especially those, because that's what the king list is best at, haunting you with precision. If it were vague, you could dismiss it. But it isn't. It says Alulim ruled for 8 Sars, 1 Ner, and 40 years. That's not storytelling. That's an accountant writing in blood. And that's where the final theory enters. What if it wasn't Sumerian in origin? What if they inherited it? Some scholars have suggested that the Sumerians may have stumbled onto a memory, a much older oral tradition from a now vanished people. That the antediluvian kings weren't their ancestors, but relics of someone else's world. A world drowned, a system erased. If true, the king list is less a document and more an obituary for a lost timeline. And just when you think you've hit bottom, the list whispers one last thing. The flood wasn't the tragedy, it was the update. The kingship, the list says, descended from heaven twice. Once before the flood, once after, like a software reinstall. Like someone saying, let's try again. This time with shorter lives, smaller ambitions, and less access to divine power. And yet the blackheaded people still remembered. They still wrote it down. And now, thousands of years later, you're staring at that list, feeling something you can't quite name. Not belief, not disbelief, something closer to vertigo, because the king list doesn't care whether you think it's real. It knows you're still following its calendar. There's a lull in the air after the flood, not just in the myths, but in your gut, as if something too large to understand just slipped past and left you blinking. The Sumerians don't dwell on the destruction. They don't describe it with biblical wrath or divine fire and brimstone. No, they handle it like accountants handling a line item. Then the flood swept over. That's it. Just a cosmic shrug, just a new page. Because what matters isn't the flood, it's what came before. See, the Sumerians told us that before the flood, there were kings. Not god kings in some vague metaphorical sense, actual rulers. With names, with cities, with reign lengths so absurd they make modern human history look like a blip. These are the antediluvian kings, and they are terrifying. Let's go back to the king list. We talked about Alulim and Alulgar, those impossibly ancient rulers, with reigns stretching 30,000 years or more. But that list doesn't just invent them out of thin air. It places them in locations. It roots them in cities like Eridu Badabira and Larak, real places we've dug up with real bricks and broken pots. So what do you do with that? These kings ruled real cities, but in unreal time. Were they legends, grafted onto archaeological sites? Were they metaphors for dynasties? Were they invented to give legitimacy to later kings? Or were they something else entirely? Let's talk about Ubaratutu, a name so forgotten that it feels like a typo in a video game. He's listed as the last king before the flood. His reign, 18,600 years. His city, Shuruppak. He's also the father of Ziusudra, the Sumerian version of Noah, the man chosen by the gods to build a boat and survive the deluge. And Ziusudra doesn't just survive. He gets something else, immortality. The gods, in what appears to be a post-flood reconciliation gesture, grant him eternal life. But they don't let him stay. He becomes removed, a ghost in the machine, a witness to the old world, living quietly in the edges of mythology. That's the pattern here. The flood didn't just wash away cities. It washed away context. Before it, kings lived for millennia. They spoke with gods. They may have been gods or something close. After the flood, everything becomes limited. Lifespans are mortal. Power is questioned. The gods are more distant, more ritualized, as if the flood introduced a firewall between realms, which raises a strange question. What exactly was lost? The Sumerians seem unsure. They preserve the names. They keep the cities, but they don't explain. They don't moralize. The kings before the flood aren't punished for hubris. They're not decadent or corrupt. They're just different. It's as if the Sumerians didn't remember the why, just that there was a before, and it ended, which makes the antediluvian kings less like fallen heroes and more like echoes, resonant shapes from a forgotten structure. You can't see the original anymore, but you can still feel its outline. Some scholars, and some fringe theorists too, have taken this to a darker place. They suggest that maybe the kings before the flood weren't human in the way we understand it. That the reign lengths are records, not metaphors. That the pre-flood world operated on a different kind of time, cosmic time, mythic time, layered time. That these kings weren't flesh and blood, but systems avatars of order or knowledge or technology ruling for eons until some reset interrupted the simulation. There's no evidence for that, of course, but also there's no disproof. And that's the unnerving thing. About the Sumerians, they leave you too much room to wonder, because their own myths don't clarify much. They describe a flood, yes, but they describe it like a memo. Humans were too noisy. Gods couldn't sleep. Solution flood. It's not a punishment for sin. It's more like an IT reset, and after it, the world gets smaller. The kingship returns, but now it's in Kish, not Eridu. The gods resume their duties, but with more distance. Humans continue, but now they age, suffer, forget. It's like the post-flood world runs on limited permissions, and that word permissions is key, because that's how the Sumerians saw existence. Not as random chaos, but as structured reality. Life wasn't lived, it was granted. Your role, your status, your fate, these weren't earned. They were assigned, written into reality like lines of code. And the antediluvian kings, they were version 1.0, which makes the flood a patch, a rollback, a reboot of civilization. And the kings of the old world, they weren't erased because they failed. They were too powerful to manage. In myth, control matters more than chaos. The Sumerians weren't afraid of destruction. They were afraid of disorder. So maybe the flood wasn't a punishment, it was a containment protocol. Which brings us back to those names: Alulim, Alalgar, Enmenluana. Names without faces. Titles without stories. They're not characters. They're keys. And the king list is a locked door. Because if you could somehow crack it, if you could trace each name, each reign, each impossible year, you might find a pattern, a code, a signal from the old world still blinking beneath the sand. And that's why we care. That's why archaeologists keep digging. Why historians keep translating. Why fringe theorists keep screaming into the void. Not because we need to know what happened, but because we need to know what was lost. The antediluvian kings weren't remembered for their glory. They were remembered because they marked the line. Before them, a world of wonders, of long lives, of intimate gods. After them, memory loss. You're living in the after, but maybe the names are still speaking. In dreams, in ruins, in clay. You're ankle deep in mud, drifting through a shattered memory. All around you, the world is dripping, not with rain, but with erasure. Structures don't fall here. They dissolve. The gods don't scream. They go silent. Because in the Sumerian imagination, the most terrifying thing that could happen wasn't death. It was forgetting. And that's what the Great Flood did. It didn't just drown people. It drowned context. We talked about it briefly. How the Sumerian king list, that cold-blooded document of impossible kings, casually inserted a flood, like a programming note. Then the flood swept over. No emotion, no judgment, just a hard line in the timeline. But now, it's time to wade into it. Not just the flood, but the flood. The one that echoes in Genesis and Gilgamesh in myths from every continent. The one that wiped away whatever the world had been and gave us this broken, beautiful version we now call history. Let's start with the earliest version we have, the Genesis. It's a Sumerian cuneiform tablet from around 2100 BCE, and it doesn't waste words. The gods build cities. They assign kingship. They're running a tidy little divine simulation until they get annoyed. Why? Not because humans sinned, not because they disobeyed divine law, or made golden calves or towered too high. No. The gods got irritated because we were too noisy. That's right. The gods couldn't sleep, and instead of filing a celestial noise complaint, they decided to hit Ctrl plus Alt plus del on the whole species. Now, one god, Enki, the one who usually handles cosmic PR, warns a man named Ziusudra. He tells him to build a boat to bring animals to prepare for a deluge that will end everything. Sound familiar? It should, because this is the source code of the Noah story. Thousands of years before the Bible, Sumerians were writing about a flood survivor who built a boat, saved life, and was granted immortality for his trouble. Except Ziusudra doesn't land on Mount Ararat. He ends up on the shore of immortality, somewhere the gods stash those who've seen too much. But here's the twist. The flood isn't framed as a judgment. It's not about morality. It's about volume. Humanity annoyed the gods into hitting reset. That's a deeply unsettling view of the divine. The gods didn't care about sin. They cared about sleep. And after the flood, they don't apologize. They don't build rainbows or make covenants. They grant Ziusudra eternal life and move on. What kind of theology is that? One where humans exist at the pleasure of divine convenience. The Sumerians didn't seem surprised by this. In fact, they expected it. That's why their flood myth is less a warning and more a grim resignation. Sometimes the gods delete you just because they're cranky, and that's where the trauma lives. Because the flood myth isn't just a story, it's a scar. It shows up again and again in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Utnapishtim, Ziusudra's narrative descendant, tells his flood survival tale to a grief-ridden king. In Babylonian myth, in Akkadian tablets, in the Hebrew Bible, in Hindu scripture, in Norse legend, in Mesoamerican cycles, in Chinese mythology. Everywhere you look, someone's building a boat, and someone else is erasing the world. Why? Because the flood isn't just a physical catastrophe. It's a symbolic one. It's the event horizon where memory can't escape. Before the flood, the world was magical, unknowable, populated by god-kings and unspoken truths. Afterward, it's tame, bounded, historical. We go from eternal reigns to year-by-year tax records, from communion with gods to rituals that beg for scraps of divine attention. In other words, the flood didn't end the world. It narrowed it, and the Sumerians, those dusty geniuses of the Delta, remembered. Not clearly, not with blueprints and video footage, but in clay, in names, in unease. They turned the flood into infrastructure, built it into their stories, their temples, their ziggurats. The Epic of Gilgamesh itself is haunted by it. Gilgamesh, in his grief over the death of Enkidu, seeks immortality. He finds Utnapishtim, the man who survived the flood. He demands answers. And what does Utnapishtim say? Essentially, you can't go back. The flood severed the connection. Before it, men could be gods. After it, they die. Always, without exception. This is why Gilgamesh fails. He falls asleep during his immortality trial. He drops the magical herb that could have reversed mortality. The world isn't broken. It's locked. That's what the Sumerians feared most. Not death, not punishment, but disconnection. The flood wasn't a clean slate. It was a firewall. And even though they rebuilt, reinstalled kingship, restarted temples, recalibrated their calendars, they knew something had been lost. Something no ritual could restore. Something older than the gods they prayed to. They carried this knowledge in their literature, in their architecture, in the way they obsessed over order. Lists, records, hymns, laws. They were trying to anchor themselves in a world that had once been wider, because somewhere deep down they feared it might happen again. They knew the flood wasn't a one-time event. It was a pattern. Collapse. Reboot. Forgetting. That's why they wrote it down. Why they burned it into clay. Because the next flood might not be water. It might be time. It might be silence. It might be you, lying in bed tonight, hearing the wind rattle the windows and wondering why you can't remember that dream you had when you were a child. The one where everything was bigger, older, brighter. The flood didn't just wash away the world, it washed away the beginning. And the Sumerians, bless their tired blackheaded souls, were the first to realize that the only thing more terrifying than dying is not remembering why you lived. You stand at the base of a massive ziggurat, looking up through the haze of time, and your ears catch something odd chanting. Not melodic, not warm. It's a low mechanical rhythm, like a language recited by something that doesn't need to breathe, something older than breath. And at the center of it, all sitting like administrators behind the curtain of reality, are the Anunnaki. Forget what you've heard. No, really, wipe the pop culture slate clean. These aren't ancient aliens with ray guns or the reptilian overlords of YouTube documentaries. And they're definitely not the kindly gods of Olympus who fall in love with mortals and throw parties on mountaintops. The Anunnaki are something else entirely. In Sumerian mythology, they are the great gods, but not in the way we understand gods today. They aren't omniscient. They aren't infinite wells of love and justice. They're management. They don't care if you're good. They care if you follow the protocol. You could say they're divine, but you wouldn't want to meet one in a dark temple. There's Enlil, the god of wind and authority, stern, irritable, and responsible for approving that infamous flood. There's Enki, the god of wisdom and freshwater, more charming, more clever, and often playing both sides. There's Inana, the goddess of war and love, a walking contradiction wrapped in divine perfume and blood. But the Anunnaki aren't just individuals. They're a council, a bureaucracy of beings who manage the me, the divine blueprints of existence. Think of them as the ones holding the source code of civilization. They're not good or evil. They're functional, cosmic regulators, and their biggest sin, they get tired. Yes, according to myth, the Anunnaki once performed the labor of maintaining the world themselves. They dug canals, built temples, managed offerings. They got their hands dirty, literally. For a time, these gods weren't sitting in ivory clouds. They were out in the mud with everyone else. But then they snapped. Too much toil. too many spreadsheets, too many humans chanting the wrong syllables during grain season. So they revolted against themselves. Specifically, the lesser gods among them, often called the Ig, were the ones who walked off the job. And the solution: create a new species to handle the workload humans. We weren't made to be free. We were made to be useful. The Anunnaki delegated, and we became the help. You feel that deep down, don't you? That strange, ancient guilt. That echo of being born under obligation. It's no accident. The Sumerians didn't see themselves as chosen or favored. They saw themselves as necessary annoyances tools, given just enough consciousness to follow divine orders with the occasional offering to keep the peace. And the Anunnaki weren't nurturing parents. They were system admins. Their job wasn't to inspire you. It was to make sure the machinery of reality kept working. The weather, the harvest, the moon's phases, the ritual sequences. If things went wrong, it wasn't because the gods were angry. It was because the process had been broken. Fix the process, resume order. That's how the Anunnaki operated. It's eerie how much they resemble algorithms. You pray to Enlil, not because you love him, but because he's the switch that toggles the rain. You don't negotiate with Inana. You input the right sacrifice and hope she doesn't crash your relationship that month. In this view, the Anunnaki aren't divine in the emotional sense. They're cosmic functions. And here's the part where things get even stranger. The Anunnaki didn't always agree. Their mythologies are full of backroom deals, divine feuds, policy overhauls. Enki tricking Enlil, Inanna demanding entry to the underworld, Anu playing the role of cosmic CEO, but barely doing anything useful. This wasn't a religion of perfection. It was a divine soap opera with bureaucratic stakes. And that makes the human role all the more precarious. Because if the gods are fallible, then the system is unstable, which means your life, your harvest, your child's health, your dreams are all riding on, which God got out of bed angry that morning. That's why the rituals had to be perfect. Why the priests spent years memorizing syllables. Why temples weren't just places of worship, they were interfaces. You didn't worship the Anunnaki, you accessed them. Just like a technician runs diagnostics on a network, you offered sacrifices and incantations to align yourself with their will, to sync your reality with the divine firmware. If you got it right, the harvest came. If you got it wrong, famine floods frogs. Maybe even an extinction event if Enlil's had a rough week. And still, the Sumerians didn't rebel. They adapted. They named, categorized, labeled everything. They built ziggurats to reach the heavens, not as monuments of pride, but as terminals. Stacks of brick and bitumen designed to bring you closer to the Anunnaki. Not to see them, but to connect. Because connection was everything. Without it, you were just noise. And we all know how the gods feel about noise. So here's where the existential dread creeps in. The Anunnaki might not be gone. Not in the mythic sense. They may have simply disconnected. Their temples are ruins. Their names are forgotten. But the systems, the clocks, the base 60 time, the obsession with records and contracts and assigned roles, still running like background processes that never got shut off. You wake up, punch in at your job, follow protocols, perform offerings, coffee instead of sheep, and you feel it. That same urge to fulfill something you didn't ask for. That same bureaucratic haunting. It's not spiritual, it's structural. The Anunnaki may not be watching, but their software still runs the world. If you had to sum up Sumerian civilization in one word, it wouldn't be temple, or king, or even ziggurat. It would be something more cryptic, something quietly humming beneath the surface of their myths, their rituals, their entire worldview. That word is me. No, not me as in you, or me, or a selfie caption. We're talking about the me, those strange divine decrees that governed everything from how to bake bread to how to rule an empire. And no, they're not metaphorical. The Sumerians didn't see these as vague ideas floating around the heavens. They saw them as literal, tangible, transferable objects. You could own a me. You could steal it. You could hoard it. And if you had the right one, you could change the world. Let's break this down, because the me aren't like anything else in mythology. They weren't commandments. They weren't blueprints. They weren't even magic spells. They were more like operating system modules. Each me was a self-contained packet of cosmic instruction. It didn't just describe how something should be done. It encoded its existence. There was a me for kingship, for truth, for weaving, for prostitution, for wisdom, for noise, for silence, even for the act of destroying a city. If it could be experienced, there was a me governing it. Want to create a city? Better have the right me. Want to start a war? You'll need the warfare me before you can do it properly. This wasn't myth. This was a universal permission system. And the gods didn't create these me, they managed them. Like divine sysadmins, each Anunnaki oversaw certain me codes. The problem was not all of them were content to stay in their lane, which brings us to Inana, goddess of love, war, fertility, and total chaos and heals. She wasn't content with the me she was assigned. She wanted more. So she visited her uncle Enki, the god of wisdom and freshwater, who happened to be a bit of a hoarder when it came to the me. He kept them stored in his watery temple like a divine server farm. And Inana, she came with wine flattery and that classic trickster twinkle in her eye. According to myth, she got him drunk. Real drunk. Like, oops, I gave away the universe drunk. And in his intoxicated state, Enki gave her 94 of the me. Not descriptions, not summaries, the actual me themselves. And Inana, she packed them into her boat and fled back to Uruk. You can practically hear Enki sobering up mid-myth. Wait, what did I give her? His aides scramble to stop her sending creatures and sea monsters and polite warnings. Nothing works. Inanna arrives in Uruk, unloads the me, and installs them like new software into the heart of the city. Boom. Uruk becomes a superpower. This isn't a story about thievery. It's a story about uploading civilization, because the me didn't just grant capabilities, they unlocked reality. Before Uruk had the me of kingship, there were no kings. Before Uruk had the me of music, there was no music. And Inanna didn't just steal tools. She curated a culture. She chose which me to take. She left others behind. This wasn't accidental. This was design. In that moment, Sumer becomes a modded world. Think of the me as plugins to the universe add-ons that expand the base game of reality. You could run a society without all of them, but it would be flat, broken, limited. When Inanna brought them to Uruk, she gave the city its texture, its shape, its mythology, its glitchy divine personality. And here's the eerie part. The Sumerians believed that everything that exists still runs on these protocols. Even today, they saw the me not as historical artifacts, but as ongoing truths. If the me of kingship is revoked, kingship collapses. If the me of truth is corrupted, society fractures. If something steals or breaks the me, reality begins to decay, which means the universe doesn't just need rituals, It needs maintenance. Sumerian priests didn't just worship, they updated. Through chants, sacrifices, and symbolic reenactments, they tried to reinforce the integrity of the me. If the divine code glitched, you didn't pray for mercy, you filed a cosmic bug report. And this brings up something wildly ahead of its time. The idea that reality isn't solid, it's programmable. What if the Sumerians weren't just making metaphors? What if they were remembering a system where behavior, society, emotion, even architecture was structured by hidden functions? A system where someone once had admin access. A system that was taken hidden or corrupted. And we, the blackheaded people, have been living in the downgraded version ever since. In that context, Inana's theft of the Ami wasn't blasphemy. It was restoration, a jailbreak. She wasn't disrupting divine order. She was patching civilization with tools Enki had selfishly kept locked away. Which begs the question, who wrote the me in the first place? Enki didn't invent them. He inherited them. No myth says where they came from. They just are, like source code without a signature. And if the me still exist, where are they now? Maybe they were metaphorical all along, or maybe not metaphorical enough. Maybe they're buried in lost libraries. Maybe they're disguised as fragments of language. Maybe they're embedded in our rituals, our laws, our instincts. Maybe every time a civilization discovers something new, they're just reactivating a forgotten me. That's what the Sumerians believed. They weren't the first to write. They were the first to restore the protocol. And even now, as you lie here in the dark, listening to the soft hum of your own consciousness, you're following scripts you didn't design. You wake, eat, love, fight, build, not because it's instinct, but because the me told you to. You stand before a ziggurat. It's not the first one you've seen tonight, but this one, it feels different. The air around it buzzes, not with electricity, but with alignment. You notice how its levels don't just stack like a layer cake for the gods. They step upward, like instructions. A stairway of geometry. Each terrace, not merely architecture, but function. You're not looking at a temple. You're looking at a terminal. Let's talk about ziggurats, not as religious symbols, not as primitive pyramids, but as technological devices built with cosmic precision. The word ziggurat comes from the Akkadian zigguratu, meaning to build high or to rise up. But the Sumerians had their own word for these structures, Ekor, house of the mountain. Except Mesopotamia doesn't have mountains. These were artificial elevations in a world that was flat, wet, and determined to sink you back into mud the moment you let your guard down. So why stack thousands of tons of brick into the sky? Not for tourists, not for fun. The Sumerians believed the gods lived in the heavens, but needed stations on Earth to interact with the world. Ziggurats weren't places to go inside. They had no inner chambers, like Egyptian pyramids. Instead, they were interfaces, platforms, places for gods to descend to. Think of them as signal towers, giant dusty antennas connecting Earth to heaven. Each level was calibrated. Each corner faced a cardinal direction. The stairs weren't symbolic, they were functional. A ramp for the divine. And that's not exaggeration. In temple hymns, we find repeated references to gods descending from the ziggurat and ascending back to the heavens. Not in dreams, not in metaphors, but in literal appearances. The top of the ziggurat, the temen, or bond between heaven and earth, was where this connection occurred. And what powered this divine link? The me. Yes, those divine codes we just talked about. Ziggurats weren't just spiritual hotspots. They were repositories of the me. Each city had its own configuration of divine functions stored, enacted, and maintained through ritual at these towers. So, if Uruk had the me of kingship. Its ziggurat contained the ritual protocols to maintain that authority. If Eridu had the me of wisdom, its temple stored the chants and alignments that allowed reality to recognize knowledge as a thing. And each of these had to be updated frequently. That's why Sumerian priests weren't quiet monks. They were engineers. They chanted syllables in exact patterns. They performed daily rites not to flatter divine egos, but to stabilize the system. One wrong gesture, and the me might fail. A forgotten offering, a mispronounced word. Suddenly, truth starts bending. Crops fail. Memory erodes. This is how they saw it. The world ran on divine code, and ziggurats were data towers. Now look at how they built them. Ziggurats were made of mud brick, at the core fired brick on the exterior, not random. Mud absorbed heat and moisture, regulating internal temperature. Fired brick resisted erosion. And each level wasn't just taller, it was painted. Color-coded layers. One blue, one white, one black. Some had gold at the summit. These colors weren't aesthetic. They represented zones, sky-earth underworld, frequencies. Climb the ziggurat and you ascend planes of reality. You're not just going higher, you're shifting alignment. Some scholars laugh this off. Oh, it's just religious symbolism, they say. A primitive way of showing closeness to the gods. But the Sumerians weren't symbolists. They were technicians of belief. Their gods didn't respond to emotion. They responded to structure. You built the ziggurat, right, ran the correct protocol, and ping contact. You didn't need faith. You needed precision. And if you really want to get strange, consider this: the Sumerians believed these structures didn't just connect them to gods. They connected them to order itself. They had a word for this concept, yes, but also Nam. Nam was destiny, cosmic identity, a thing's isness. And if a ziggurat fell into disrepair, if the rituals stopped, the Nam could be lost, not just for individuals, but for entire cities. Ur falls, Lagash crumbles, Eridu disappears, not because of armies, but because their links to cosmic order decayed. Now imagine walking through a Sumerian city. You see the ziggurat rising like a staircase to the stars. At its base, priests performing complex rituals. On its steps, statues of lions, bulls, dragons, each a symbol, a warning, a reminder that you're standing in a place where reality is thin. At the top, a small, simple room, the Gigunu, a waiting room for the god. Not lavish, not ornate, just a space, an invitation, because the point of the ziggurat wasn't for you to go up. It was for something else to come down. And what came down? Well, no one says exactly. But consider this: the Sumerians weren't surprised by gods. They expected them. They created calendars of when each god would visit, like corporate reps on a rotation. Festivals weren't celebrations. They were appointments. Rituals weren't for fun. They were sync points. Get the timing wrong, and you might miss your god entirely. Or worse, invite the wrong one. So the ziggurat had to be perfect. Each stone, each step, each word. A single glitch in the ritual, and the signal goes fuzzy. The me destabilize. The god arrives, misaligned, and that's not something you want. Ask the Babylonians. Centuries later, they built a massive ziggurat Anunaki, the foundation of heaven and earth. Some believe this was the inspiration for the Tower of Babel, a structure so massive, so perfect, that it threatened to reconnect the heavens and earth without divine permission. And we all know how that ended. The god responds. The connection is scrambled. Language shatters. Civilization stutters. Not punishment, not wrath, just signal interference. So the next time you see a ruined ziggurat, don't think of it as a dusty temple. Think of it as a dead terminal, a server that once connected the physical to the divine. Now quiet, now severed, but maybe still humming faintly, waiting for someone to reboot the system. The wind rustles across the shattered stones of a forgotten schoolhouse, and the echoes it stirs aren't voices or laughter, they're syllables. Ancient, jagged, hard to pronounce. Sumerian, a language that once ruled 1,000 tablets and now sleeps in museums, half decoded and wholly alone. You can still hear it if you squint hard enough. A scribe hunched over a clay tablet stylus pressed to wet earth. His lips move. His teacher shouts. His fingers tremble. He writes it again because Sumerian does not forgive, and yet it persists. Even though Sumerian is dead, let's be clear. This isn't the kind of death where a few people stop speaking it, and it lingers in lullabies or folklore. No one speaks Sumerian now. No one really spoke it, even back when it was still being written. By the time of the Babylonian Empire, Sumerian had become a frozen ritual language like Latin today, only stricter, more sacred, and even more frustrating to conjugate. But before that, it was everything. Sumerian was the language of law, trade, astronomy, medicine, math, and myth. If you wanted to write something down in southern Mesopotamia between 3100 BCE and 2000 BCE, you did it in Sumerian. It was the language of record, and Sumerians were obsessed with recording things. You get the sense they didn't entirely trust memory. And why would they? After the flood, after the gods cut the power cable between heaven and earth, no, the Sumerians understood that if it's not written down, it will be lost. So they wrote everything. Names, offerings, rations, hymns, contracts, spells. They didn't see writing as a tool, they saw it as a binding force. To name something was to fix it in the cosmos. But what happens when the people who spoke the language disappear? Well, the language becomes something else. By 2000 BCE, Sumerian was already being replaced in everyday speech by Akkadian, a Semitic tongue that would dominate Mesopotamia for centuries. The shopkeepers, the farmers, the soldiers, they all started speaking something new. But the priests, the scribes, they kept the old words because the gods spoke Sumerian. You don't pray in street slang. You don't issue divine decrees in the language of gossip and bartering. You use the sacred tongue, the one that once summoned reality into alignment. And so Sumerian became liturgical. It stopped evolving. It stopped absorbing new slang or simplifying its grammar. Instead, it fossilized. Teachers taught it in school. Students memorized entire texts, not to chat with their neighbors, but to maintain cosmic protocol. The result, a language that lived on, not in mouths, but in hands, in styluses, in clay. And if that sounds familiar, it should. Latin did this. So did Sanskrit. So did classical Chinese. But Sumerian was first. It was the prototype for the idea that a language can outlive its people, that a system of words can become so sacred, so tightly woven into the operating system of a civilization that it doesn't die when you stop speaking it. It just shifts categories. It becomes code, which brings us to the truly strange part. We still don't fully understand Sumerian. We've translated thousands of tablets. We know the basics. We can read legal texts, hymns, administrative receipts. But there are massive gaps, entire layers of nuance lost because there's no related language to compare it to. No Rosetta Stone. No living descendants. Sumerian is a language isolate. That means it's not related to anything else we've ever found. It's not Indo-European. Not Semitic, not Dravidian. It's other, a standalone. It's like opening a file on your computer and getting an error. Program not supported. Linguists have tried to crack it for centuries. Some have gone half mad, chasing grammar rules that loop like paradoxes, verbs that refuse to behave, plural forms that mutate based on cosmic whim, a noun system that looks at Latin and laughs, and yet it works. The Sumerians built an entire civilization on it. They used it to manage cities, to catalog dreams, to speak to gods, which raises a question no one wants to ask out loud. Who gave them this language if it didn't evolve from an earlier tongue? If it didn't come from nearby cultures? If it appears suddenly fully formed, with enough structure to support law, literature, and astronomy, where did it come from? Some say divine origin, that it was given not grown. Others say it's simply a lost branch, an ancient cousin of something we haven't found yet. But the Sumerians themselves, they didn't wonder. They just used it to write, to bind, to preserve, because that's what mattered. And you get the sense they knew it would disappear from speech one day, that people would stop using it at market or in lullabies. But they weren't worried, because the tablets would remain. Thousands upon thousands of clay records buried in libraries, temples, rubble, waiting. And when we found them, when modern archaeologists pulled them from the dirt and began the slow, painful process of translation, it was like decoding the firmware of civilization. Not myth, not metaphor. Instructions: how to organize a city, how to pray, how to measure time, how to grieve. The language is broken now. Chipped, misunderstood. There are arguments about how to pronounce even the simplest words. Scholars debate whether certain signs are nouns or verbs, or both. But the signal still comes through. Sumerian whispers. It whispers from the past. But not just from the past. From the foundation. Because even now, your world runs on shadows of it. The contracts you signed, Sumerian invented them. The hours you count. The calendar you curse. The time that ticks by while you try to fall asleep. All built by people who spoke a language that no longer has a voice, but still has power. Because language doesn't have to live to function. It just has to be remembered. So next time you pass a museum exhibit or glance at a weird wedge-shaped symbol in a history book, pause. Somewhere in that jagged line is a piece of reality written by someone who believed that if they could just carve the words right, they might make the world stay. Somewhere deep in the desert, where cities once stood and priests once chanted to absent gods, a voice rises not from a human throat, but from the earth itself. A low murmur of regret, a lament. Not from the victims, but from the ones who fell in love with order and couldn't stop it from crumbling. This is the curse of Akkad. And yes, it's exactly as ominous as it sounds. Let's rewind a little. The Akkadian Empire, founded by Sargon the Great around 2300 BCE, was the world's first true empire. Not just a city-state or a cultural hub, but a sprawling dominion stretching across Mesopotamia. It united Sumerians and Akkadians under a single rule. It blended languages. It standardized weights, calendars, and temple systems. In many ways, it was the spiritual heir of Sumer streamlining and scaling everything the blackheaded people had built. And it worked for a while, but then it collapsed. Hard. What followed wasn't just a fall. It was a cultural earthquake. Cities emptied. Crops failed. The rivers dried up. Bandits roamed where priests once walked. And in the midst of this unraveling came a literary response unlike anything else from the ancient world. The curse of Akkad isn't a royal decree. It's not a historical record. It's a poem, a dirge, a haunting narrative written after the fall of the Akkadian Empire, likely around 2100 BCE, and attributed to scribes from the city of Ur. Its tone, deeply bitter, weirdly intimate. It doesn't just blame invaders or natural disasters, it blames the gods. It opens with a glowing depiction of Akkad under the rule of Naram-Sin Sargon's grandson. At first, all is well. The city is blessed. The gods dwell in its temples. The economy hums. The priests sing. Life is calibrated. But then Naram-Sin does something unthinkable. He attacks the god Enlil, not metaphorically, not spiritually. He physically leads troops to destroy Enlil's temple in the holy city of Nippur. And why? Because Enlil stopped answering. The god withdrew his favor, stopped responding to rituals, cut the divine Wi-Fi. And Naram-Sin, whether out of desperation or arrogance, declared war on the source of divine order. It's the ultimate blasphemy, and the fallout is swift and apocalyptic. The gods abandon Akkad. The winds shift. The rains stop. The soil turns to powder. The canals fill with dust. Famine spreads. Enemies swarm. It's not just a military collapse. It's ontological. Reality itself seems to reject the city. But here's the twist. The poem isn't written by Akkadians. It's written by Sumerians, the people who arguably suffered under Akkadian conquest are the ones mourning its fall. They're not dancing in the ruins. They're not praising the gods for righteous judgment. They're writing an elegy. Why? Because the Sumerians understood something profound. When a civilization collapses, everyone loses. Even the victors, even the gods. The curse of Akkad isn't about revenge. It's about disconnect. It's about what happens when the divine order, the cosmic infrastructure upheld by ritual, by ziggurats, by language, by the me, breaks down. And it wasn't just about one empire's arrogance. It was a warning. Because if the gods can abandon Akkad, they can abandon anyone. And if that happens, nothing holds. The poem doesn't end with redemption. It doesn't offer a path to salvation. It ends with silence, with absence, with a once great city swallowed by dust and memory. And yet the poem itself is a kind of resurrection. By writing it, the Sumerians did what they always did when faced with chaos, recorded it. To write something down was to bind it, to give it shape, to tame it. Even disaster, especially disaster. So they wrote the curse of Akkad not to condemn Naram-Sin, but to acknowledge the fragility of order. Because they knew the truth. You can build the tallest ziggurat, write the most precise rituals, memorize every sacred word, and still fail. Because the gods are not guaranteed. Favor is not permanent. Reality is not stable. And yet they kept building, kept writing, kept invoking. Because the alternative silence was worse. Some historians see the poem as political propaganda, a way for Ur to distance itself from the chaos of Akkad and reassert divine favor. Others see it as theology, a reinterpretation of collapse as punishment for sacrilege. But maybe it's both. And maybe it's more, because hidden in the verses is something that feels incredibly modern doubt. You can hear it in the repetition, in the lamentations, in the way the poem keeps asking, why did this happen, without ever really answering? The Sumerians aren't sure. They thought they understood the gods. They thought the rituals were enough. But when the system crashes, even the high priests have to ask, did we break it? Or was it always broken? That's what makes the curse of Akkad so chilling. It's not just about loss. It's about the uncertainty of reality itself. If a city like Akkad could fall, rich, pious, mighty, then what chance does anyone else have? And yet, the poem doesn't advise despair. It advises memory. It tells the story again and again, like a backup file, like a hard copy for the next generation. So they'll remember even the most sacred system can crash, and maybe next time they'll build it stronger. But if not, at least someone will remember that it once worked, that a city once stood here, that people once believed they were in harmony with the gods. And that harmony, no matter how brief, is worth mourning, because a civilization doesn't die when its walls crumble. It dies when it's forgotten. And the Sumerians, they never forgot. They wrote it down. They whispered it into clay, so that thousands of years later, long after the wind had swept the dust across the broken gates of Akkad, you would lie awake at night, hearing the echo of their fear, their regret, their stubborn refusal to let silence win. And somewhere buried in that echo, a warning. Even the gods have limits. You step into a dark room, lit only by oil lamps, and it smells like sulfur, dried herbs, and clay tablets still warm from the kiln. A priestess in a high headdress chants words older than language, and behind her, a scribe carefully copies the same words onto a tablet, not to record them, but to activate them. Because in Sumer, words weren't decorations, they were functions. This isn't magic, the way we understand it. There are no pointy hats or flying brooms, no flash powders, no dramatic wand waving. Sumerian magic wasn't about spectacle. It was about execution. It was about precision. You want a ritual. You follow the recipe, step by step, wrong order, wrong results. That's because Sumerian magic was closer to software engineering than sorcery. Let's start with the core belief that reality is not chaotic, but coded, governed by the me, and maintained by ritual. Everything, disease, drought, dreams, demons followed patterns. And if you knew the pattern, you could intervene, not overpower, not defeat, just realign. Let's say your house is cursed. Your child is sick. Your fields are wilting. You don't scream into the sky. You don't stab a voodoo doll. You go to the Ashipu, the incantation priest. Think of him as a cosmic IT guy. His job isn't to destroy evil, it's to debug you. He brings his tablet, his toolkit of sacred objects, bitumen, cedar oil, clay, figurines, maybe a goat's liver on the side. He reads the omens, runs diagnostics, traces the error back to its source. Maybe a neglected offering, maybe an unclean spirit. Maybe your neighbor muttered something shady near a shrine last week. Then he performs a ritual repair. That could mean an exorcism, or an offering, or a substitution ritual where a clay model of the afflicted person is destroyed in their place. This isn't superstition. It's spiritual maintenance. You're not begging the gods to like you. You're just trying to reset the simulation. And these rituals were documented with a level of thoroughness that would make a modern lawyer proud. We've found clay tablets detailing every step, the order of recitation, the exact tone of voice, the direction you should face, the color of the string you tie around the statue, the time of day, the corresponding star alignment. Get one wrong, and the whole thing might backfire. Or worse, do nothing at all. Because Sumerian magic wasn't about belief. It was about compliance. You didn't believe the ritual worked. You ran it. And sometimes the fix was permanent, sometimes temporary. Sometimes it needed to be renewed like a cosmic subscription. And if that sounds bureaucratic, it's because it was. This was a world where gods had ledgers, where fate had settings, where demons followed contracts and rules. Yes, demons. They weren't red-horned cartoons. They were entities, glitches in the code. Some were sent by the gods to enforce cosmic order. Others were errors, stray bits of malevolence leaking through cracks in the system. Take Asaga demon, so foul his mere presence made fish boil in rivers. Or Lamashtu, a terrifying she-demon who preyed on mothers and newborns. You didn't fight these beings with swords. You used incantations, long measured sequences of syllables designed to trap, bind, or confuse. And these weren't spells in the Harry Potter sense. They were contracts. You spoke them aloud, and reality listened, but only if you got it right. That's why the Baru the Diviner was equally important. His job was to read omens, not to predict the future in vague riddles, but to diagnose current status. He'd analyze animal livers, the flight of birds, the shape of oil on water. It sounds strange until you realize it's no different from modern data analytics. Each omen was a data point, interpreted through a known system. Tablets were full of comparisons. If the right lobe of the liver is long and the gallbladder small, the enemy will fall. If the sun sets behind a black cloud on the third day of the month, war will come from the east. These weren't guesses. They were readings, like checking the health of your simulation. And if the reading came back wrong, you fixed it with rituals. Sumerians believed that misfortune wasn't random. It was the result of cosmic imbalance, a missed sacrifice, a forgotten rite, an insult to a statue, a dream ignored. So, you corrected the imbalance, sometimes with offerings, sometimes with confession, sometimes by symbolically transferring the sin to a goat and sending it into the wilderness. Yes, that's where we get the idea of a scapegoat. But always, the goal was the same. Restore harmony, not emotional harmony, not personal peace. Functional harmony, a world where the me align the gods nod and the water flows again. And what about curses? Oh, they had those too. A well-executed curse was basically a targeted system crash. You didn't just wish harm on someone. You invoked legal grounds to dismantle their luck. You'd write their name on a tablet, pair it with an incantation, and bury it at a crossroads, or better yet, burn it at the feet of a neglected shrine. Because divine favor, when turned against you, is like flipping a switch. And yes, there were counter curses, just like antivirus software. The Sumerians were nothing if not thorough. But here's the wildest part. Despite the elaborate rituals, the careful incantations, the obsession with rules, they knew it didn't always work. Some tablets include disclaimers. If this incantation fails, repeat it 3 times. If the goat does not bleat, the ritual must be redone. Even in their magic, there was error handling. It's eerily modern, because in Sumer magic wasn't belief-based. It was process-based. And maybe, just maybe it still is. Every time you knock on wood, every time you avoid walking under a ladder, every time you say something out loud to make it real, you're not performing superstition. You're running old code. So next time, something strange happens, an odd dream, a streak of bad luck, a computer that won't turn on until you mutter threats at it, don't panic. Just remember, the system isn't broken. It's self-correcting. And somewhere buried under 5,000 years of dust and clay, a Sumerian priest is nodding in approval because you're still trying to get the ritual right. It's late. You're lying still wrapped in a blanket like a freshly mummified priest. And for a moment, you slip into that strange half-dream where the world isn't quite solid. You're neither awake nor asleep, just floating. And that's exactly where the Sumerians believed the truth lived, not in waking life, not in the afterlife, but in the realm of dreams. For the Sumerians, dreams weren't nonsense. They weren't your brain-flushing data or a byproduct of cheese after midnight. They were portals, messages, warnings. sometimes even meetings with gods or the dead. But just like the rest of Sumerian existence, they had to be interpreted properly. Let's start with the basics. Not all dreams were created equal. Some were sent deliberate communications from the gods' ancestors or supernatural beings. Others were incidental, just echoes of the day's chaos, meaningless noise in the system. And the real art was figuring out which was which. Enter the dream interpreter, a specialist often linked with temple priests and scribes. Their job wasn't to ask you how the dream made you feel. Their job was to break it down like an algebra problem, because dreams were data packets from the divine. Scrambled symbolic but decodable. Let's say you dreamt of a river overflowing its banks. The interpreter wouldn't ask if you've been stressed lately. They'd check the dream tablets. Yes, there were actual tablets cataloging dream symbols. If a man dreams of a river that floods his house, the gods are angry, and illness may come. If a woman dreams of flying like a bird, the favor of Inana is near. If one sees themselves naked in public, expect a loss of social status. Sound familiar? It should. These were the ancient world's first dream dictionaries. And while modern psychology might chuckle, the Sumerians weren't playing around. They believed the dream realm was a shared domain, a place where gods and mortals could briefly coexist. Not unlike a phone call, brief, unreliable, but deeply important. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, dreams play a central role. Both Gilgamesh and his companion Enkidu received dreams sent by the gods, visions of future battles, omens of death, cryptic riddles. Before making any major decision, a hero in Sumerian myth doesn't ask a general or consult a priest. He sleeps. He waits for a message. He dreams. And this wasn't a passive thing either. There were entire rituals designed to induce dreams, what we'd now call incubation rites. A person might sleep in a temple courtyard, burn specific incense, recite hymns, or perform purification rituals to invite a divine dream. You didn't just hope the gods would talk to you in your sleep. You scheduled it. Dreams were treated like consultations. And if the gods responded, you didn't just smile and move on. You went straight to the temple and told the priest. The dream was analyzed, recorded, and if necessary, acted upon. Offerings were made, warnings heeded, wars delayed, because once a dream was received, it became a matter of public concern, which says a lot about how the Sumerians viewed the world. To them, reality was layered. Waking life dreams, ritual space, the underworld, they weren't separate dimensions. They overlapped, intertwined, interacted, and dreams. Dreams were the leak point, the only place where the membrane thinned enough to let meaning pass through. But this also meant dreams could be dangerous. If the gods could enter your dreams, so could other things. Demons, spirits, malevolent forces with no interest in communication. Nightmares weren't just mental distress, they were invasions. You could be cursed in a dream, possessed, bound by something you couldn't name. That's why dream interpretation wasn't a casual profession. It was defensive work. You had to know how to identify not just divine messages, but spiritual malware. Which brings us to the rituals of cleansing. If someone was plagued by terrible dreams, the Ashipu, the ritual priest, might perform a dream purification rite. This could involve washing with sacred water, burning incense, or writing the dream on a tablet, and then breaking it, symbolically shattering its hold. They didn't just talk about dreams, they acted on them. And again, we're not so different today. Think about it. You wake up after a particularly strange or powerful dream. It clings to you. You replay it. Maybe you look up a symbol or two. Maybe you tell someone. Maybe you change something. We still believe somewhere deep down that dreams mean something. The Sumerians just formalized it. They gave it infrastructure. Of course, not all dreams came from the divine. Some were just noise. The Sumerians even had a word for them, shutu dreams, that are empty nonsense without message. But even then, they didn't dismiss them outright. They saw them as weather shifts in the soul's climate, a change in the internal atmosphere, worth noting even if no action followed. And every now and then, a dream would defy interpretation. Too strange, too vivid, too real. And those were set aside, marked, filed under not yet understood. And maybe those were the ones that mattered most, because for all their rules, their rituals, their records, the Sumerians understood something that modern science sometimes forgets. Not all meaning is measurable. Some of it slips through in whispers. Some of it only shows up when the conscious mind turns off. And some of it wears the shape of a lion-headed eagle flying backward over a ziggurat while reciting your mother's name in a language you've never heard. Don't try to explain that. Just listen, because even now, as your breath slows and your eyes start to flutter shut, a little voice in the oldest part of your brain is preparing the signal. The same one they waited for, the same one they feared. A dream, a message, a question in disguise. Close your eyes. It's almost time to read the code. Let's say you've managed to survive the flood, the famine, the gods, and your own dream demons. Congratulations. But now, you're standing in a field in the dead of summer, sweating into your linen kilt, trying to figure out why your grain hasn't sprouted. You've prayed. You've sacrificed. You even broke out the good incense. Still nothing. So you look up. Because in Sumer, when the world below gets confusing, the answers are usually above. That's where the stars live. And the stars, they don't lie. The Sumerians were not just stargazers. They were celestial accountants, tracking every blink and shimmer in the sky, with the same meticulous obsession they gave to taxes and goat inventories. To them, the night sky wasn't a passive backdrop. It was a living spreadsheet, and every god, every city, every human ambition had a corresponding point of light. The oldest star charts we have, some of which are Sumerian, date back over 5,000 years. Carved into clay tablets, these records tracked planets, lunar phases, constellations and eclipses with a level of detail that still stuns modern astronomers. They knew Venus moved in cycles. They knew Jupiter took longer to return. They didn't just notice these patterns, they built religious calendars around them. And the gods, they had addresses in the sky. Each major deity was paired with a celestial body. Inana, goddess of love, war, and chaos. She was Venus, bright, beautiful, and occasionally terrifying. Nana, the moon god, literally the moon. Utu, god of justice, the sun. The sky was divine infrastructure. And the priests, they were technicians of time. Each night, a special class of scribes called the Mul.Apen observers would climb onto rooftops or ziggurat terraces and log star positions. They recorded heliacal risings the first time a star became visible before dawn, after being hidden by the sun. These events weren't just noted. They were used to predict seasonal shifts, festivals, even omens. That's right. The stars didn't just tell time. They spoke, and what they said mattered. If Venus disappeared from the sky for too long, war was coming. If the moon rose with a red hue, the king might die. A comet brace for famine. An eclipse. Better pray that temple protocol is airtight because the divine signal just glitched. This wasn't fortune-telling. It was system maintenance. The Sumerians believed the heavens reflected the state of the divine order. If something went wrong, above it meant something had gone wrong below or would soon. So star watching wasn't passive. It was preventative ritual. You didn't just observe the stars. You interacted with them through hymns, through rites, through acts of symmetry mirroring celestial events with earthly ones, like building temples aligned with solstice points or planting crops based on lunar phases. This wasn't superstition. It was feedback control. And if you think that sounds advanced, well, it is. In fact, some of their observations were so precise that Babylonian astronomers, thousands of years later, used their data to refine more complex models. And there's something else. They may have known about the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that shifts star positions over millennia. There's no tablet that spells it out clearly, but there are hints. Observations that don't make sense unless you realize they were watching the stars move in ways that couldn't be explained in a single human lifetime. How do you track a cycle that takes 26,000 years? You don't unless you're compiling data over generations. Unless you're treating astronomy like cultural memory, which of course the Sumerians did, because astronomy wasn't a side hobby, it was statecraft. Only priests and kings had access to the full records. The power to interpret the skies meant the power to set the calendar, declare the new year, choose when to wage war, when to fast, when to celebrate. He who controls the heavens controls the schedule, but here's the part that really makes your brain itch. They didn't just map the skies for practical reasons. They mythologized them. The stars were gods. The gods were stories, and those stories played out in the sky again and again, year after year. One famous example, the descent of Inanna. Inanna dies, descends into the underworld, and is eventually resurrected. A dramatic emotional myth, but it also perfectly mirrors the visibility cycle of Venus. When Venus disappears from the sky, as it does during conjunction, it was said Inanna had gone below. When it returns bright and defiant, the goddess has risen again. It's not just poetry, it's astronomical theater. And by participating in these stories, by timing festivals and rituals to celestial movements, the Sumerians believed they were synchronizing themselves with the divine, tuning the instrument, aligning the human world with the cosmic rhythm. That's what the Ziggurats were about too. Not just towering monuments, but observation decks. They weren't built to dominate the skyline, they were built to see beyond it. From their heights, you could track the stars map, the planets verify omens. You could confirm that the divine codes, were still functioning properly. Because if the stars stopped behaving, that wasn't just bad luck. That was existential danger. You don't survive a flood and rebuild civilization from clay and prayer without becoming a little paranoid about the sky. So the Sumerians watched. They tracked. They charted. They trusted the stars to warn them. And when they didn't, they rewrote their stories. Because to the Sumerians, history wasn't linear. It was celestial. It curved. It repeated. It shimmered. And if you lost the pattern, if you stopped looking up, you risked everything. That's what made astronomy sacred. It wasn't just about knowing where you were in time. It was about remembering who you were in the story. And tonight, as you lie, they're staring up at your ceiling, or maybe out a window into the still dark sky. One last thought drifts through. The stars you see, some of them haven't changed in 5,000 years. The same points of light that guided Sumerian priests still burn above you, still blinking, still whispering, still waiting for someone to remember how to read them. You're standing in a Sumerian city at dawn. The streets are quiet. The air smells like dust and bread dough and goat. And suddenly, clang a bell rings, not just to wake the city, but to call its citizens to judgment. Not the divine kind. Not yet. This is a legal proceeding, and it's already underway. The Sumerians didn't just invent cities, writing, and timekeeping. They invented law. And we're not talking about vague moral codes or oral traditions. We're talking about codified, documented, enforceable law carved in stone and written in cuneiform, with penalties, clauses, exceptions, and fines for improperly watered donkeys. Let's start with the most famous, the Code of Ur-Nammu, often overshadowed by the flashier and later Code of Hammurabi. Ur-Nammu's code predates it by centuries, around 2100 BCE. And while Hammurabi's code is engraved on a towering black stele for the gods to see, Ur-Nammu's is practical, businesslike, clay tablet, compact, but the structure revolutionary. Each law begins with a condition. If a man commits a murder, then a consequence. That man must be killed. Straightforward and often surprisingly measured. Many offenses didn't result in death, but in fines, compensation to the victim or the temple. This wasn't Wild West vengeance. This was regulated justice. The law didn't just punish, it calibrated, which in true Sumerian fashion makes it feel more like software than scripture. You input a crime, the system returns a verdict. Execution, compensation, or correction. It wasn't perfect, but it was predictable. And predictability was everything in a world governed by unstable gods, unpredictable floods, and sudden divine silences. The law was their counterweight, but Sumerian justice wasn't blind. It was aware of status, your class, your gender, your temple rank. They all shaped how the law applied to you. A high-ranking priestess could expect more leniency than a commoner. A merchant might be fined for an act that would cost a slave his life. Sound familiar? It should. The foundations of modern law contracts, evidence trial procedures begin here. But they begin with an uncomfortable truth. Equality under the law was not assumed. It was aspirational. And even then, you needed to document everything. That's why the Sumerians invented contracts. Clay tablets weren't just for keeping track of barley. They were legal instruments. Buy a field. Write a tablet. Marry someone tablet. Adopt a son. Rent a boat loan. Silver to your cousin. Tablet, tablet, tablet. Each with witnesses. Each with seals. Each stored in temple archives, like the Mesopotamian version of cloud storage. And that's where another layer of magic comes in. Because to the Sumerians, writing a thing down made it real. Spoken words were temporary, vulnerable, forgotten. But cuneiform lasted. Writing wasn't just documentation. It was binding. That's why breaking a contract wasn't just a legal offense. It was a spiritual fracture. You'd violated the cosmic order. The agreement had been witnessed by scribes, yes, but also by the gods. Especially Shamash, the god of justice, truth, and the rising sun. His symbol, a solar disk often carved above legal tablets, wasn't just a logo. It was a divine seal of oversight. And if Shamash was watching, you really didn't want to lie under oath. Perjury could result in fines, banishment, or death. Not because it offended human law, but because it messed with the operating system. Justice in Sumer wasn't abstract. It was a maintenance task, like irrigation, like festival rites, like balancing temple accounts. It kept the world running, kept the gods invested, kept the me from falling apart. So every trial, every contract, every code wasn't just civil order. It was cosmic participation. And law didn't stop at crime and property. It touched everything. Family, inheritance, debt, marriage, divorce, even love. We found ancient divorce tablets. Some of them read like legal poetry. He has declared, "You are not my wife." She has replied, "You are not my husband." Therefore, they are free. It's elegant, respectful, final, because even the end of love needed to be written, witnessed, and filed properly. And then there's adoption. Sumerians valued lineage, but not just by blood. Adoption was common formalized through legal tablets that stated obligations, inheritances, and terms of care. Sometimes a man would adopt an adult as a son in exchange for labor or care in old age. It wasn't emotional. It was contractual kinship, again structure over sentiment, not because they lacked feeling, but because they believed feeling alone couldn't preserve order. Only ritualized form could, and perhaps the strangest part, we still do it. We still notarize, sign, swear, file, stamp. We still trust that the presence of paper or pixels makes things real. That's the ghost of Sumer still haunting our legal systems, still whispering from clay tablets, buried under layers of time. Write it down, or it didn't happen. And here's the final twist. The law wasn't created by gods. It was created by humans but given divine legitimacy. That's a subtle but critical difference. The gods didn't hand down laws from on high. Kings, scribes, and priests wrote them, then framed them as divinely sanctioned. This allowed the system to evolve. New rulers could issue new codes, update the rules, patch the bugs. Law was living firmware, not holy dogma. And if that sounds familiar, like constitutions, amendments, bills, well, now you know where it started. So next time you sign a form, or hear a legal phrase, or watch a courtroom drama, remember this: you're still operating inside a system designed by people who wore linen robes and carved words into wet clay with sticks. People who lived in cities surrounded by walls beneath stars that told time-worshiping gods who required structure more than sacrifice. People who believed that justice wasn't a dream. It was a code, and as long as someone was willing to uphold it, the world would keep running, even if the gods weren't watching anymore. You're back in the city wandering through the market of The sun is high, the alleyways buzzing with voices, and everything smells like copper-baked date sheep and whatever someone just spilled on that corner tablet. And then there it is, a quiet little stall tucked between the fishmonger and the perfumer. No shouting, no flashy signs, just a woman gently spinning a thread from wool, her fingers faster than thought. This is not just weaving, this is infrastructure. In Sumer, textiles weren't fashion. They were currency. They were religion. They were cosmic alignment in fabric form. Let's unravel that. The Sumerians were master weavers, not just in the literal sense, but in the way they wove economy, ritual, and identity together through thread. And the person at the loom, more often than not, she wasn't a servant or background character. She was a priestess, a ritual weaver, a technician of reality. Start with the basics. Textiles were a major part of the Sumerian economy. Before coins, before minted currency value was measured in silver weight and wool garments, not just for trade but for temple offerings. Gods didn't want gold. They wanted robes, fine ones, brightly dyed, carefully cut, ritual grade. Entire temples had weaving workshops, organized tiered highly skilled production centers. They weren't sweatshops. They were sacred factories where cloth was woven not only for people, but for the gods themselves. Yes, the gods had wardrobes. Statues in temples were regularly dressed, washed, perfumed, and even fed. It wasn't symbolism, it was maintenance. You wanted the god to inhabit the statue, then treat it like a VIP. And that meant tailored robes. Each city had its own weaving style, its own color codes. Some dyes were common, earthy browns, muted reds. Others, expensive, sacred, nearly mythical. Blue, from imported lapis or indigo. Crimson, from crushed insects. These colors weren't fashion, they were language. A robe dyed red might signify war or passion. A robe in deep blue, authority, cosmic intelligence, Enki, energy. But it wasn't just color that mattered. It was pattern. Weaving wasn't random. It followed traditional sequences, many of them passed down for generations, and believed to hold protective or sacred power. Certain zigzag motifs were linked to water deities. Certain knots were thought to ward off illness, and certain weaves could only be used for temple garments, never civilian ones. Because each thread was encoded, weaving was ritual syntax. It's no accident that in later cultures, the idea of fate is represented by weavers. The Greek moirai, the Norse norns, even metaphorical phrases like the fabric of reality. It all begins here, with women at looms in sunlit courtyards, threading order into the world. And if that sounds poetic, you'd better believe the Sumerians saw it that way too. They had hymns praising the Gudu, the sacred weavers. Their work wasn't domestic, it was cosmic. Because if you messed up a temple garment, if you used the wrong thread count or dye or symbol, you didn't just ruin cloth, you interrupted the divine channel. That's why weaving wasn't left to chance. Girls trained from childhood, especially those bound for temple service, learned weaving alongside reading and ritual. You didn't just learn how to spin, you learned when, under which moon, with which incense nearby, with which chant humming low in your throat. Weaving was timed, synchronized with the stars, the festivals, the me. Even the tools mattered. Some looms were upright, some horizontal, some mobile. Each had different symbolic connotations. Some spindle whorls were carved with prayers spells or signs of specific gods. When a weaver worked, she didn't just move thread, she moved meaning. And this didn't stop at clothes. They wove curtains for shrines, bands for ritual drums, coverings for sacred statues. Each item more than useful, each item active. This isn't so different from how we think of computer coding today. A piece of string doesn't mean much on its own, but a sequence of strings, woven in the right order, with the right pattern, that's information, that's function. And if you look closely at Sumerian vocabulary, you'll see something beautiful. The word for weaving is closely tied to the word for ordering. To weave was to impose form on chaos, to take raw, unspun fiber, messy, tangled potential, and shape it into something stable, repeatable, durable, something that could hold warmth, identity, divinity. Now expand that idea. Weaving becomes a model for civilization. And maybe that's why Inana, goddess of both war and love, is also the patroness of weavers. Because weaving is power, quiet power, endless repetition, invisible structure, fragile threads made strong by pattern and tension. And war, it's just weaving undone, the unmaking of fabric, the cutting of threads. But love, that's weaving too. Two people's lives knotted together, a bond that can fray or stretch, but if woven with care, holds. And so we return to the market, to the weaver's stall. She's not smiling. She's not rushing. Her fingers know this dance by heart. And you realize she's not just making a garment, she's maintaining a system. So much of Sumer was like that, small gestures with massive implications. A thread tied to a statue, a ritual thread cut, a mourning shawl woven in black for a priest whose prayers went unanswered. You can feel the weight of it, because even now, we still weave to understand. We still talk about networks, threads, fabricated truths, textiles of society. We sit at keyboards that replaced looms, but the action, the impulse, still there, to take what's scattered and bind it, to take silence and make it speak. So next time you thread a needle, or wear a patterned shirt, or run your hands across an old blanket, pause. That's not just fabric. That's history. That's a prayer in disguise. You're walking through a courtyard paved in sun-baked brick, and the wind is thick with the scent of onions oil and something roasting over a communal fire pit. Somewhere nearby, a drum is pulsing a low, patient rhythm, and voices rise in song, not individual, not polished, but collective. You're not at a concert. You're in a ritual meal. Because in Sumer food wasn't just sustenance, it was contractual. The gods didn't just demand temples or offerings or prayers, they wanted dinner. Let's back up. The Sumerians believed their gods needed humans for one key reason: to feed them, not metaphorically, literally. After the gods created mankind, according to myth, to relieve themselves of manual labor, they realized their celestial stomachs didn't self-fill. They needed temples, priests, offerings, barley oil meat bread. Not once, not twice, but daily, and not just tossed onto an altar. These meals were prepared according to strict protocol, measured, seasoned, placed on special tables within temple kitchens. Every portion had purpose: the thigh bone to Enlil, the liver to Nana, the wine to Inana. And then the food would sit, absorbed by the gods through its divine essence, a concept we can barely wrap our modern brains around. The meal remained, but its spiritual nutrition was believed to have been consumed. Think of it like holy bandwidth. The flavor stayed, the power didn't. Then yes, the food would be redistributed. Servants, priests, even the poor might receive leftovers. This wasn't scandalous. It was expected. The gods got the spirit. The people got the body. Divine recycling. And it wasn't just feeding the gods out of respect. It was survival insurance. If you didn't make your regular offerings, it wasn't just impolite, it was dangerous. The god might leave, withdraw their presence, or worse, become angry. And angry gods didn't yell. They let your crops rot. They let your water turn sour. They let your enemies win. So people paid attention, and not just to the food itself, but the ritual of it. The Sumerians had designated kitchen staff at every major temple complex. Bakers, brewers, butchers, servers, each with a precise role. Hymns were sung during preparation. Chants were recited while pouring oil. Certain foods had seasonal significance. Others were used only in emergencies, like plagues or eclipses. And what about ordinary people? They ate too, of course. And for them, meals still carried spiritual resonance. You didn't just eat to live. You ate to align. Feasts were tied to the calendar, to eclipses, to harvests, to royal anniversaries. Each bite reinforced your place in the cosmic order. And fasting. Yes, that too. In times of mourning or penance, you didn't eat, not because food was unclean, but because your relationship with the divine had temporarily paused. Until balance was restored, sustenance was withheld. And then the celebration returned. Because when things went well, harvests were bountiful omens, favorable rivers, generous, the Sumerians feasted like champions, not quietly, loudly, collectively. Whole communities would gather to eat under the stars. Bread in wide, flat rounds, beer in communal jugs sipped through reeds, stews thick with beans, onions, garlic sheep meat, and spiced oil. No forks, of course, just fingers, shared bowls, laughter, and always in the background, a prayer. May the gods be satisfied. Because eating wasn't the end of the ritual, it was the ritual. There's even evidence that food offerings were used in legal contexts. Imagine sealing a contract over a meal blessed by the gods. You're not just agreeing, you're sharing sacred nourishment. If you break the contract, you've defiled the meal. The consequences, not just legal cosmic. But here's the best part. The Sumerians didn't treat this as grim duty. They loved food. Their tablets are packed with recipes, instructions, ingredient lists. They were foodies before the word existed. They knew how to ferment pickle preserve. They understood umami before science had a word for it. We've even recovered a few of the world's oldest recipes from Sumer. One of them, a rich lamb stew, seasoned with onion, garlic, coriander, and beer. Yes, beer. Sumerians brewed dozens of types. They even had goddess Ninkasi, patron of beer, to watch over the process. Her hymn, it's a recipe in verse, a poetic brew guide. That's how they saw food, not just necessity, but cultural technology. And if you were particularly devout, you might offer your meal's first bite to the gods. Set it aside. Let it rest on a small altar or feed it to the fire, not out of superstition, but because your meal, however humble, mirrored the temple meal. You weren't eating alone. You were dining in sync with the divine. Even the shape of Sumerian dining reflected this mindset. Communal dishes, circular seating, shared portions. Meals were a network, not a private event. Even kings ate with their courts. To eat alone was to disconnect from the chain of mutual blessing. And when someone died, they were buried with food, because the journey to the afterlife was long, and you'd want snacks. Sometimes entire jars of beer were buried, loaves of bread, bits of roasted lamb, all wrapped lovingly in linen or placed beside the dead, like reminders you're not forgotten. Food was memory. Food was prayer. Food was proof that the world still made sense. So next time you sit down for a meal alone, or with others, pause for a second. Maybe tear off a small bite of your sandwich. Maybe place it gently on a napkin. Maybe don't even eat it. Just acknowledge it, that you are here, that you are fed, that the gods, whatever shape they take in your world, have not yet turned their backs. You're still in the system, still getting your updates, still breaking bread in the presence of something older than hunger. Because long before restaurants or food blogs or plastic forks, there was a table in Uruk, and around it sat priests, servants, gods and ghosts, all waiting for the bread to rise. You're crouched next to a wide, slow-moving canal. The mud is cool beneath your feet. Reeds rustle behind you. The air hums with gnats and frogs and a quiet tension, because this isn't just irrigation. This is survival engineering. The Sumerians didn't build cities in deserts by accident. They did it because they understood water. And controlling water in ancient Mesopotamia was more powerful than controlling armies. It meant life. It meant gods stayed happy. It meant you could write poetry about floods instead of being consumed by one. So how did they do it? Let's begin with a map, imaginary but accurate. You've got two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, flowing roughly parallel through southern Iraq. Between them, mud, endless mud. Fertile, yes, but only if controlled. Too little water and your barley dries up. Too much and your house becomes a soggy tomb. Enter the canals. The Sumerians engineered one of the earliest and most complex irrigation networks in human history. And they didn't use pumps or pressure valves. They used gravity, geometry, and bureaucracy. Every major city-state, Uruk Lagash, was laced with artificial canals. Water was diverted from the rivers into primary channels, which fed secondary canals, which fed field ditches, which fed furrows. All of it calculated, timed, managed. And it wasn't just for agriculture. These canals supported transport, sanitation, cooling systems, even religious processions. You don't build a ziggurat without water to make bricks. You don't feed a city without irrigation. And you don't stay alive when the gods stop the rains unless you've already taught the earth how to think in channels. And here's where things get fascinating. This wasn't just practical, it was spiritual. The Sumerians believed the rivers themselves were divine beings. The Euphrates, a gift of Enki, the god of fresh water and wisdom. The Tigris, fiercer, faster, more chaotic, often linked to Ninurta, god of war and irrigation. Water wasn't neutral, it was alive, and so controlling it wasn't just engineering. It was cosmic negotiation. Every irrigation decision, when to flood, when to dam, when to release, was backed by ritual. You couldn't just dig a canal. You had to bless it, offer something, ask permission, because in Sumer, if you moved water without asking, you weren't just a bad farmer, you were provoking the gods. That's why irrigation was embedded in law, the code of Ur-Nammu, full of water regulations. If a man lets water flow over the field of his neighbor, he shall measure out grain and pay. If he neglects to maintain the dike and the water destroys a field, he shall restore the loss. There were even canal inspectors officials who walked the ditches checking for leaks blockages, illegal diversions. It wasn't just infrastructure, it was surveilled structure, and it worked. Because the Sumerians didn't rely on rainfall, Mesopotamia is largely dry, so they turned rivers into programmable water routes. They managed floods with temporary basins, controlled droughts with stored reservoirs, and timed their planting cycles around calculated releases. They were in essence running the world's first hydraulic civilization. But just like any complex system, sometimes it broke. Floods still came. Crops still failed. And when that happened, it wasn't just a climate problem. It was a cosmic malfunction. That's when the priests stepped in. Water rites were some of the most elaborate in the temple calendar. Entire festivals revolved around cleansing renewal and reconnecting with the sacred waters. One such ritual was the sacred marriage, a symbolic union between the king and the goddess Inana. It wasn't just about fertility in the bedroom. It was about ensuring the canals stayed full, that the goddess granted abundance, that the king, by performing the right gestures and reciting the right hymns, kept the land hydrated through divine favor. Because the king wasn't just a ruler, he was the maintenance technician of abundance. And water, that was the main system that needed constant updates. They even embedded water into their mythology of creation. According to the Eridu Genesis, the world began in water. The sweet and salt water mingled. Life emerged. The first gods were born. It wasn't a garden paradise. It was a hydrological event. The Sumerians didn't dream of Eden. They dreamed of balance, the kind you can only achieve when you understand flow rates, soil salinity, and how to keep silt from choking your canals. And they were always adapting. As cities grew, they expanded irrigation, created long-distance channels, innovated with new materials. They understood seasonal shifts, knew the signs of too much sediment, predicted when a canal would breach. Their records show continuous updates to their water systems, like software patches written in clay, but nothing lasts forever. Eventually, the rivers changed course. Canals silted up. Political infighting disrupted maintenance. Wars destroyed dikes. And worst of all, salinization. Too much irrigation done improperly leaves behind salt. And salt ruins soil. By the time of the later Babylonian periods, parts of Sumer were producing half the grain yields they once did. Some cities were abandoned not because of invaders, but because the land died beneath them. It's one of the first recorded examples of ecological collapse due to over-engineering. The system became too efficient, too dependent on maintenance. And when human focus shifted, when temples lost power, kings lost vision, and priests lost funding, the whole thing began to fail. But the canals, you can still see them. From satellites, lines etched into the soil, like wiring from an ancient motherboard. Proof that once a people understood water deeply enough to rewrite geography. And today, we build dams, we redirect rivers, we pipe water across deserts, but we still suffer droughts. We still fight over irrigation. We still miscalculate the cost of abundance. And maybe we still forget to ask permission. So next time you turn on a faucet or watch rain splash against your window, remember, you're touching a very old contract, signed in mud, sealed in clay, and upheld by people who once believed that flow was the holiest force of all. A chill hangs in the room, not from cold air, but from the weight of presence. There are no lights, only a soft flicker from a nearby lamp. A clay statue looms in the center, wide-eyed, unmoving carved hands pressed together in eternal prayer. It doesn't blink, doesn't breathe, but it's watching you. Welcome to the world of Sumerian statues. Not decorations, not idols, but inhabited devices. See in Sumer, when you sculpted a figure of a god, you weren't creating art. You were building a receiver, a node, a terminal, something for the divine to plug into and operate through. Let's begin with the basics. Temples in Sumer weren't empty, echoing halls. They were active spaces centered around one object, the cult statue of the city's patron deity. And this statue, it wasn't symbolic. It was literally the god, not a representation, not a reminder, but the god's presence anchored in clay, stone, gold, or wood. The statue didn't just sit there. It lived there. It was there. And because of that, it had needs. It had to be clothed, fed, bathed, perfumed. Hymns were sung to it at dawn. It was put to bed at night. Priests didn't just manage temple business, they attended to the divine body. This wasn't metaphor. It was logistics, because if the god wasn't cared for properly, it might leave, withdraw its presence. And once that happened, the statue was just an empty shell, a powerless form, which is why consecrating a new statue was such a big deal. You didn't just carve it, install it, and go about your business. You had to activate it, and that activation, it was called the opening of the mouth ritual. In this ceremony, the mouth, eyes, and ears of the statue were symbolically opened so the god could enter, see, hear, speak, dwell. Incantations were chanted, sacred tools were used, offerings were made, and when it was done, the object became sacred tech, a functioning interface between heaven and earth. And the statue wasn't always alone. There were attendant statues, smaller figures of humans, often carved with wide, anxious eyes and clasped hands. These weren't toys or decorations. They were proxies. You could commission one your own little clay self and place it in the temple. It would pray for you, constantly. While you were at home, working, sleeping, arguing with your spouse over barley prices, your statue was on duty, whispering prayers, absorbing divine attention, maintaining your spiritual credit. It was the original subscription service. Some people even left duplicate statues in multiple temples, kind of like backing up your soul to more than one server. And yes, this got competitive. The richer you were, the more elaborate your votive figure. Fancier inscriptions, better materials. Some were made of alabaster or copper. One guy, a high-ranking official, had a statue with its own beard stylistically curled in divine homage, because in Sumer, Your devotion was measured in visibility. If your statue was placed closer to the main cult figure, you were closer to the god literally and spiritually, which meant better blessings, better crops, better luck. It wasn't humility. It was network proximity. And statues weren't just left for gods. They were used in contracts, curses, even memory. If someone broke a promise, you might inscribe it on a tablet and place a statue beside it, one that watched. To violate the deal wasn't just betrayal, it was being witnessed by a being that never slept. And if you wanted revenge, you could commission a statue of your enemy, bind it ritually, and bury it under a crossroads or temple floor, a practice not unlike early versions of a curse doll. But perhaps the strangest use of statues, replacements for the dead. If a person of status couldn't be buried in a proper tomb or needed to be remembered during a ritual, they might be replicated in miniature. Not to preserve appearance, but presence. That's the Sumerian obsession again, not with symbols, but with function. They didn't ask, "What does this represent?" They asked, "What does this do?" And the answer, it holds space for something else. So when you see a Sumerian statue, those big inlaid eyes and stylized beard and clenched hands, they're not passive. They're listening. That's why damage to these figures was so severe. Destroying a statue wasn't just vandalism. It was murder, spiritual assassination. Conquering kings often defaced enemy idols, not to insult them, but to deactivate them. Smash the eyes, break the mouth, sever the link. The god would leave, the city would fall. And then the conqueror might cart the broken statue back home, not to worship, but to display as a captive, proof that their own gods had triumphed. And yet, even in ruin, those statues retained some power. You can feel it, can't you? Looking at one in a museum case today. Its body chipped, its eyes hollow, and still something stares back. Not the god, not the person, but the function, still active, still echoing. And in a strange way, we've never stopped doing this. We build monuments. We place photos on altars. We carve names into stone. We surround ourselves with images designed to hold presence, to remember, to invoke, to maintain some link between here and elsewhere. Even now, we stare at digital avatars, Zoom icons, profile pictures, little rectangles that act on our behalf. Our own tiny votive statues, still clasping their hands, still whispering across the void, still watching. So next time you pass a sculpture or see an old carved figure tucked behind glass, pause. It may not blink, but something is still awake in there. Something very, very old. The sun dips low over the Ziggurats. The shadows lengthen. The streets quiet down. But somewhere deep inside a temple lit by oil lamps, heavy with incense, there's a sound like a chant, a shiver of reed pipes, and the slow, rhythmic thump of a drum. You're not at a concert. You're at the house of heaven, the temple. But not just any temple. This is Uruk, the sacred mountain. A place not built, but placed bridging the human world and the divine software that runs behind it. To understand Sumer is to understand that their temples weren't churches or mosques or basilicas. They weren't built for crowds. They weren't for preaching. They were machines. Big, dusty, glorious spiritual machines. Let's start with structure. A Sumerian temple wasn't just a building. It was an operating system embedded into the city's physical and spiritual landscape. Every line, every wall, every room had purpose. Think of it like a motherboard shrines as processors, altars as power sources, gates as access points. And at the heart of this system, the cella, the inner sanctum, Not a grand chamber, not even that big, but terrifyingly potent. This is where the god resided, literally, not metaphorically. A statue, yes, but more than that, a node of divine attention. Only priests entered here, not because they were better, but because they were trained. Temple work was precise, procedural, every motion calibrated, every word rehearsed. The temple was sacred not because it was spiritual, but because it was fragile. Misstep, and the connection could glitch. Let's talk about the workforce. Sumerian temples weren't quiet meditation halls. They were economies. They owned land. They raised livestock. They employed thousands: scribes, cooks, brewers, dancers, musicians, weavers, blacksmiths, janitors, astrologers, and yes, priests. Temples functioned as bank schools, storehouses, and judicial centers. They were the nucleus of the city, not peripheral, central. To live in a Sumerian city was to orbit a temple the way planets orbit a star. And this centrality wasn't symbolic. It was practical. If you needed food during famine, you went to the temple granary. If you needed a loan, the temple scribe might record it in cuneiform with interest rates based on celestial omens. If you wanted to marry, divorce, adopt, or testify, temple. The gods weren't passive recipients of incense and hymns. They were managers, and the temple was their office. Now let's talk music, because if the temple was a machine, then music was its boot-up sequence. Every ritual was preceded by sound hymns, pipes, lyres, clapping, and percussion. The goal, not entertainment, synchronization. By aligning sound breath, rhythm, and voice, the priests believed they could match the frequency of the divine. And again, this wasn't vague spirituality. This was systems architecture. If the rhythm was off, if the chant syllables were mispronounced, the gods might not respond. Or worse, they might misinterpret the signal. So the temple wasn't just run by theologians. It was run by technicians of the sacred, and every festival was a system-wide update. You've heard of one, the Akitu Festival New Year. Massive processions, symbolic battles between chaos and order, temple reenactments of the gods' defeat of darkness. But it wasn't just pageantry. It was cosmic restabilization. Each year, the connection between gods and cities was renewed like a subscription that had to be ritually reauthorized. If the Akitu failed, if the rituals were flawed, if the people didn't participate, the consequences weren't spiritual discontent. They were system collapse. The world would no longer recognize its own order. And so the temple priests practiced like musicians before a concert. Every gesture memorized, every phrase burned into muscle memory. They weren't improvising. They were running ancient code. And here's a detail you'll love. In many cities, the temples themselves were named with startling specificity. House that connects heaven and earth. House of radiant justice. House built upon a far-off mountain. These weren't poetic flourishes. They were descriptions of function. Each temple was a node in a network that stretched across cities, across time, across planes of existence. Temples were not identical. Each had unique rituals, songs, instruments, statues, and divine contracts. You didn't just walk into one temple and expect it to work like another. The settings were customized, and the gods, they were not omnipresent. They lived in their temples. If a statue was captured or destroyed, the god's presence could depart permanently. So the temple wasn't just symbolic housing. It was literal support infrastructure for the divine, and maintenance that was constant. Priests washed the statue daily, burned incense, sang dawn hymns, lit sacred fires. reset altars, offered food that the gods absorbed energetically, then distributed to staff and the poor. It was a closed-loop system. Nothing wasted. Everything ritualized. Even the floors. Yes, some temples had inscribed thresholds with curses against intruders. Not because they were paranoid, but because temple space was mathematically sacred. To cross into it wrongly was like typing code into the wrong field. The system could crash. So, what happens when the temple falls? When war breaks out? When statues are looted? When priests scatter? That's not just cultural loss. That's cosmic disconnection. It's no coincidence that when empires collapsed, Akkad-ur, Babylon temple damage, was often the first and final blow. Because temples were not symbols of power. They were power itself, and yet, somehow traces of that system remain. Cathedrals, mosques, shrines, spaces built, not just to be beautiful, but to channel, to echo, to interface. Even now, when you enter a quiet building, light a candle bow, your head, it feels like something is waiting, still connected, still humming. So the next time you visit a sacred space, no matter the culture, no matter the age, pause. Look around. Notice the angles, the windows, the echoes. You are inside something designed, not just for awe, but for alignment. A sacred operating system 5,000 years old, still running in soft whispers and scented smoke, still trying to keep the world stable, one chant at a time. It's just past midnight now, and the Sumerian city is quiet. No chariots clattering on the stone, no market haggling. The ziggurat looms in silhouette. But beneath this calm, something else moves in ink and clay, in numbers carved by candlelight and silence that speaks louder than war. You're not in a temple, you're in a record room, because behind every myth, ritual, and God, there's one constant in Sumerian civilization: accounting. Yes, accounting. Not the sexiest corner of history, but in ancient Sumer, it was divine. The Sumerians didn't invent writing to tell stories. They invented writing to count things. How many goats did you loan? How much grain is owed? Who owes whom what? What did the temple distribute last harvest? You needed receipts. You needed math. And from that need emerged a revolution. Let's rewind. Around 3300 BCE, Sumerian temple economies began managing surpluses, grain, sheep, fish, textiles. That meant storage, distribution, labor, trade. Suddenly, oral agreements weren't enough, so they created tokens, small clay objects, each symbolizing a different commodity: a cone for grain, a sphere for oil, a disc for sheep. You'd seal the tokens inside a clay envelope called a bulla and inscribe a symbol on the outside showing what was inside. Eventually, someone had a brilliant idea. Why not just skip the tokens and write the symbols directly? Boom. Cuneiform. Writing was born from math. And what began as math became management. The earliest tablets are basically spreadsheets, lists of names, quantities, dates, and totals. Priests and scribes used these to track everything from crop yields to temple staff payments. But the truly genius part, they didn't just record numbers. They created a base 60 numerical system. That's right, sexagesimal. 60-based. Why 60? Because it's incredibly divisible. It can be evenly split by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and more. That made it perfect for fractions, for measuring land time and weight. And yes, you still use it. There are 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle, all thanks to Sumerian math. They invented units so elegant, so enduring, that we're still living on them 5 millennia later. But Sumerian math wasn't just for taxes. It was used in astronomy, architecture, music, and ritual. Want to know when to plant barley? There's a chart. Want to construct a ziggurat with perfectly aligned steps? There's a ratio. Want to tune a lyre to the harmonic intervals pleasing to the gods? There's a formula. Their scribes weren't just number crunchers. They were engineers of reality. And these scribes, they trained hard. School wasn't playtime. Sumerian scribal education, called the aduba, or tablet house, was intense. Students copied the same texts over and over. They learned signs, grammar, and math through repetition, correction, humiliation, and yes, occasional corporal punishment. One student tablet reads, "My teacher beat me because I did not know my tablet." And honestly, that's fair, because once you graduated, you controlled the levers of power. A good scribe could read contracts, map stars, calculate rations, record laws, and perform rituals. They weren't background staff. They were system administrators. In many cases, scribes had more power than generals or priests. Why? Because they could read the world literally, and their tools. Clay tablets, styluses measuring chords, counting boards. Yes, counting boards, precursors to the abacus. They used these to calculate everything from land plots to temple taxes. And land. That was the big one. Land was wealth. Land was status. Land was divinely allocated, which meant you needed land registries, long lists of who owned what, where the boundaries lay, what was due to the temple, and when. This wasn't casual bookkeeping. It was cosmic alignment. Every plot had to be measured, inscribed, sealed, because a mistake on a boundary marker could trigger feuds, lawsuits, even divine retribution. That's why the Sumerians used measuring rods, ropes, and standardized units like the shusi and the nindan. These weren't just tools, they were sacred instruments. To measure was to impose order on chaos. And order, that's the first duty of civilization. Now consider this. The Sumerians had no calculators, no paper, no pencils, just clay. Yet they achieved accurate trigonometric calculations, knew how to square fields, calculated interest on loans, determined compound growth over time. They understood exponential math before there was even a word for it, all carved into wet slabs of earth, then baked in the sun. And some of those tablets, still legible today. Meanwhile, your laptop from 5 years ago, dead. There's something poetic in that the oldest data we have, the earliest remnants of human thought, isn't etched in gold or ink or digital code. It's mud, ordered mud, which brings us back to the record room. Imagine a temple with rows upon rows of clay tablets. Each one, a story, a contract, a calendar, a receipt, a library, not of books, but of function. We've found entire archives buried beneath temple ruins. Scribes would catalog them, copy them, preserve them. Why? Because they believed that to lose data was to lose the thread of reality. You can feel it, can't you? The anxiety, the obsessive recording, the belief that if you didn't write it down perfectly, the gods might not know what to do. The rain might not come. The harvest might glitch. The stars might refuse to align. So they wrote and wrote and wrote. And through that writing, they didn't just track the world, they shaped it. So next time you jot down a note, tally, a budget, check the clock, spin a spreadsheet. Remember who started it, not with pens, not with pixels, but with clay sticks, and the terrifying belief that if you don't record it, it won't exist. And maybe they were right. A hush falls over the crowd as the king approaches. Not because of fear, though there's certainly some of that, but because something bigger is happening. This isn't just ceremony, this is alignment. Every eye watches as he raises a bronze blade. Every hand lowers in salute. Every heart knows this man isn't just a ruler. He is a pivot between the gods and the people, the sky, and the soil. This is the Sumerian king. But don't let the crown fool you. He's not the boss. He's the middleman. In Sumerian society, kingship wasn't about dominance. It was about duty, the heaviest kind. You weren't simply a war leader or a tax collector. You were the embodied interface between divine order and earthly survival. And if you messed that up, the gods didn't punish you alone. They punished everyone. Let's begin at the top, literally. Kingship in Sumerian cosmology was bestowed from heaven. That's the language they used. Kingship descended from heaven. It wasn't inherited like modern monarchies. It wasn't seized like a throne in a fantasy novel. It was downloaded, granted to a city by divine will. First to Eridu, then to Uruk, then to Ur, like passing a torch. Or rotating administrative privileges on a cosmic level. The king didn't own power. He channeled it. And with that came responsibility. A Sumerian king was expected to do a few very specific things: build and maintain temples, uphold justice and laws, lead armies when necessary, perform sacred rituals, represent the people before the gods. And all of that had to be done with humility, at least officially. Because if the king got arrogant, if he tried to claim the divine for himself, the results could be catastrophic. Remember Naram-Sin from earlier. He declared himself a god and stormed the temple of Enlil. Within a generation, the Akkadian Empire collapsed. Coincidence? The Sumerians didn't think so. That's why kings often included humble language in their inscriptions. Chosen by Inana, servant of Enlil, shepherd of the people, not conqueror, shepherd. Their job was to protect, guide, and maintain the herd. And when they succeeded, it was glorious. They built canals, expanded trade, erected ziggurats that still make us stare and wonder. They presided over festivals that realigned the cosmos. But when they failed, everyone suffered. Drought, invasion, famine, plague. The king's righteousness, or lack of it, was reflected in the weather itself. And if the people felt he'd lost the divine mandate, there were options. He could be deposed, executed, or strangest of all, ritually replaced. That's where we get the eerie tradition of the substitute king. Here's how it worked. Let's say astrologers observed a bad omen, a lunar eclipse, a blood-red moon, a star that shouldn't be there. These signs meant the current king was in danger. The gods were angry, but instead of letting the real king die, the priests would appoint a temporary substitute, usually a prisoner or servant, who would act as king for a few days. He'd wear the crown, sleep in the palace, perform rituals, then be executed, a scapegoat wearing royal skin. And the real king, he'd quietly retake the throne, spiritually cleansed, ready to reboot the system. It sounds barbaric. It was. But it also shows how seriously they took kingship. The king was more than a man. He was a ritual in motion. Even the Sumerian king list, one of the most fascinating documents from the era, reflects this view. It's a record of kings going back thousands of years, including some with absurdly long reigns. Alulim ruled for 28 to 800 years. Right. But the point wasn't realism. It was legitimacy. Each king was tied to a city, and each city was tied to divine favor. If the gods withdrew their support, kingship shifted elsewhere. Think of it like a cosmic franchise license. Your city gets to rule until the divine servers shut off. Then the title moves on. But here's the thing. Not all kings were created equal. Some were warrior kings expanding territory with brute force. Others were priest kings who focused on temple construction law and ritual. Still others were builder kings, remembered for reshaping the land, digging canals, planting date orchards, founding trade routes. And then there were kings, like Gilgamesh, half myth, half history, fully legendary. His story, immortalized in the Epic of Gilgamesh, isn't a tale of conquest. It's a tale of failure. He's strong, proud, victorious, and utterly lost. He angers the gods, loses his closest friend, searches for immortality, fails, returns home older, wiser, and finally aware that the true power of kingship isn't living forever. It's building something that lasts longer than you. A wall, a law, a name in clay. That's the true magic of Sumerian kings. They weren't remembered for being perfect. They were remembered for holding the line. When floods came, when the gods went silent, when the people despaired, they stood, and the greatest among them wrote no epic, built no monument, but left behind a tablet that simply read, "I served." That's kingship. Not domination, but devotion. So, next time you hear the word king, don't think crown and throne. Think gasket, the piece that seals the space between divine pressure and human mess. The thing that keeps the system from leaking. And maybe that's what we're all doing in our own way. Trying to hold the pieces together. Trying to serve something larger than ourselves. Trying quietly, stubbornly, humbly, to rule like the Sumerians did. You're standing in the dark again, this time beneath the surface. A narrow stone corridor stretches ahead, the walls slick with condensation. Something scrapes softly in the distance. You inhale and taste salt copper and silence. You've reached the edge of the underworld, because the Sumerians didn't believe death was the end. They believed it was a change of address to a place far bleaker, far quieter, and far more bureaucratic than any afterlife you've ever imagined. Welcome to Kur, not heaven, not hell. Something worse, Kur, sometimes translated simply as the land, or the mountain, was the Sumerian underworld. A dusty, stony domain beneath the earth. No flames, no judgment thrones, no eternal reward, just emptiness. You didn't go there because you were bad. You went because you were dead. That's it. Everyone, kings, peasants, priests, dancers, ended up there eventually. But how you arrived mattered. If your body wasn't properly buried, or your funeral rites weren't observed, or your name wasn't spoken after death, you wandered the underworld hungry. You drank dust. That was the Sumerian fear. Not punishment, but neglect. And so funerals were functional. You didn't bury someone to honor them. You buried them to equip them. Grave goods weren't luxury. They were provisions. Clay jars of beer, bowls of dates, personal seals, amulets, even board games. Yes, board games. Because apparently eternity is long and boring. But even with all these gifts, the afterlife didn't sparkle. In the myth of Inanna's descent, we get a rare backstage pass to Kur. The goddess of love and war decides to visit her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld. But the moment she steps inside, things go wrong. One gate at a time, she's stripped of her crown, her jewels, her robes, her power, until she arrives at the throne of her sister, naked and bowed. And there, she dies. Her corpse is hung on a hook. Why? Because no one enters Kur unchanged, not even gods. She eventually returns, of course, but only after someone else takes her place. That's the rule. No one leaves Kur unless someone else comes in. It's not a dungeon. It's a balancing act. There's no escape clause, only substitution. And that's perhaps the most haunting part of Sumerian death culture, its fairness. Everyone dies. Everyone goes below, even the gods, but not everyone is remembered. And that's where the real difference lies. If people remembered you tended your tomb, recited your name, poured out beer in your honor, you could remain anchored, respected, maybe even a little comfortable. But if you were forgotten, that was true death. You faded into dust and hunger. That's why tomb inscriptions mattered. Why clay seals bearing your name were pressed into burial bricks. Why tablets recorded the exact number of goats sacrificed at your funeral. Because those weren't rituals. They were payments, tokens to buy a little more comfort in Kur, and sometimes more, because Sumerian mythology hints at restless dead. Spirits who didn't get proper burials, souls who weren't appeased. They could return quietly, bitterly, to disturb the living. Not with horror movie antics, but with bad dreams, illness, crops failing, strange accidents. These weren't just ghost stories. They were technical alerts from the spirit world. Something wasn't right. Fix it. Make offerings. Find the forgotten name. Restore balance. Because for the Sumerians, the boundary between the living and the dead wasn't sealed shut. It was porous. The living had duties to the dead, and the dead, they didn't ask for much. Just memory, just acknowledgement, a name spoken now and then, a bowl of food left out, a line traced in mud. And if you really wanted to ensure your afterlife was smooth, you could commission a lamassu, a protective spirit carved in stone, winged, human-headed, lion-bodied, not as decoration, but as a guardian between worlds. Sometimes you see them at palace gates, but originally they guarded tombs, kept the silence still, stopped the dust from stirring. The Sumerians didn't hope for paradise. They hoped for peace. No pain, no hunger, no haunting, just stillness. And maybe that's why they wrote so much, why they carved their stories into clay and buried them in temple libraries, because they knew something we forget, that what happens after death is only half the story. The other half is what happens after memory. And they were determined not to be forgotten. Even in Kur, even after the Ziggurats crumbled and the canals ran dry and the gods fell silent, they left names, lines, echoes. And now, here you are, thousands of years later, remembering them. You've done your part. You've poured the offering, spoken the name, lit the candle in the dark. So if you ever feel the weight of silence pressing in, if you sense something watching, not unkindly, but longingly, don't fear. It's just the past, sitting beside you, grateful, listening, waiting for one more word. The Sumerians loved lists. King lists, god lists, star lists, even lists of exotic animals they'd never seen but heard about, like lions with horns and flying snakes. But among their most fascinating, most cryptic, most deeply strange lists is something called the me. And no, that's not a typo. It's not me as in you talking about yourself. It's me as in the building blocks of civilization. If you're feeling confused, already good. Because the me are supposed to be confusing, the term appears all over Sumerian mythology, usually untranslated, usually left dangling at the end of a sentence like a question nobody wants to answer. So, what are they? The me, sometimes pluralized as me's, are described as divine decrees, gifts, laws, technologies, principles, the fundamental components of the universe's operating system. They govern everything from truth and kingship to baking and the scribal arts. Think of them like apps, or better yet, source code. They're not instructions. They're embedded realities. If you have the me of weaving, then weaving exists. If you don't, it doesn't. Simple as that. And who had them? The gods, of course. More specifically, Enki, the god of water, wisdom, magic, and mischief. In the myth called Inana, an Enki, the goddess Inana, decides she wants more power, more tools for civilization. So she visits Enki in his city of Eridu, drinks with him a lot, and then somehow convinces him to hand over 100 me. Things like truth, music, sexual attraction, art, kingship, discontent, the destruction of cities. Wait, what? That's right. The me aren't all good. Some are destructive. Some are strange. Some feel like bugs in the system. Because the Sumerians understood something modern minds often miss. You can't have civilization without chaos baked in. You can't have law without disobedience. You can't have love without jealousy. You can't have beauty without decay. The me aren't moral. They're functional. They exist because they have to. And Enki, he's the cosmic engineer who knows where all the wires go. But in this myth, he gives them to Inanna, drunk and generous. She loads them into her boat and sails back to her city Uruk, while Enki sobers up and freaks out. He sends demons to chase her, orders them to retrieve the me, but it's too late. Inanna brings them home. Uruk becomes the cultural capital of Sumer, and the gods, they let it stand. Because that's the deal with the me. Once you distribute them, they don't go back in the bottle. You've created a world now, with rules, consequences, patterns. And this is where things get truly mind-bending, because the Sumerians didn't treat the me like metaphors. They were actual objects kept in the temples, invoked in rituals listed on tablets. Scholars debate what they looked like. Were they stones? Scrolls, software-like energy fields? No one knows. But they had names. They had weight. And they could be transferred, stolen, gifted, or lost. You could hold the me of heroism. You could receive the me of song. You could restore the me of divine law. They weren't just concepts. They were living files. And only the gods or God-appointed kings had access to the root directory. This idea that culture, ethics, art, and society all run on invisible, portable, sacred functions is so deeply foreign to our modern worldview that it makes your head tilt. But maybe it shouldn't. Maybe we're still using me. Every time we say something like, she's got the gift of leadership. He inherited his father's eye for art. They lost their way after the war. We're talking like Sumerians. We still believe in unseen forces that shape behavior. We still believe there are things you can't teach, only receive. That's the me. Hard-coded, unruly, essential. And here's another twist. The myth implies the me can be abused, that if handled incorrectly, they lead to imbalance. Because it's not enough to possess the me. You have to know how to use them. Otherwise, kings turn to tyrants. Art becomes propaganda. Music becomes manipulation. And love becomes conquest. Sound familiar? It should. Because this ancient concept buried under layers of clay, half lost in translation, might be the oldest version of with great power comes great responsibility. And who holds that power now? Well, you do. You write. You speak. You build. You create rituals. You decide what stories survive. You're holding the me of memory, of language, of curiosity. And you're using it right now to remember a civilization that never asked to be forgotten. So what does this mean? It means civilization is fragile, not because people are fragile, but because code without context breaks. The Sumerians knew that. They wrote it down, encoded it in stories that still make no sense on the surface. But deep down, they're not nonsense. They're patch notes for reality. So next time you open your phone, read a poem, vote in an election, fall in love, burn your toast, or dream of flying, pause. Because you've just accessed a me, one that was carried downriver in a reed boat 5,000 years ago, and handed to you without you ever knowing. Take care of it. Use it wisely. It's dusk in Uruk. The streets are bathed in amber light. The mud brick walls radiate a gentle warmth, and vendors are packing up their goods with slow, practiced movements. But over the rooftops, you see something moving, something impossibly fast. A flash, a scream, a blur. No one reacts. No one panics, because it's not a threat. It's a god. In Sumer, The divine didn't stay politely in heaven. The gods weren't distant abstractions or gentle metaphors. They walked. They flew. They intervened suddenly, aggressively, and often without explanation. And among them, none was more dazzling or more chaotic than Inanna. Let's talk about her. You've met gods of love. You've met gods of war. But what happens when both live in the same body? You get Inanna, goddess of love, war, sex power, fertility, storms, lions, and Venus. She's beautiful, brutal, brilliant, and terrifying. And unlike many ancient deities, she doesn't stay put. She's on the move, always, commanding armies 1 minute, seducing mortals the next, dancing, cursing, singing, slaying. Her energy is not maternal, not nurturing. It's feral, alive, and the Sumerians, they loved her for it. She wasn't safe, but she was necessary. Let's start with her most iconic story, the descent to the underworld. You remember this one from earlier, how she visited her sister Ereshkigal and was methodically stripped at each of the 7 gates. But it's worth diving deeper, because this story isn't just myth, it's spiritual instruction. At each gate, Inanna gives up something: her crown, her earrings, her necklace, her breastplate, her belt, her bracelets, her robe. Piece by piece, her identity is removed. By the time she stands naked before Ereshkigal, she is nothing. No title, no power, no armor. And then she dies. She's hung on a hook, lifeless, forgotten, and yet not abandoned. Her loyal servant Ninshibur rushes to the gods, pleads, bargains. Eventually, Enki, clever god of wisdom, creates 2 tiny beings from the dirt under his fingernails. They descend to Kur. They mourn with Ereshkigal. They empathize. And in return, Ereshkigal releases Inanna. But there's a cost. Someone must take her place. So Inanna returns above ground and immediately finds her lover Dumuzi lounging on her throne, unbothered, unchanged. Big mistake. She points. The demon sees him. He's dragged to Kur to die in her place. This myth is a masterclass in Sumerian thinking. It's about transformation, descent, loss, resurrection. Inanna isn't punished, she evolves. Her death wasn't a failure, it was a system reboot. And Dumuzi's capture, not vengeance, balance. Because even the goddess of life must trade life for life. Now let's pivot to another tale, this one more scandalous. In Inanna, an Enki, she tricks the god of wisdom into handing over the me, those sacred tools of civilization. How? She gets him drunk. Seriously. She flatters him, plies him with beer, and as he loses control, she politely asks for the me. He gives them away without realizing. It's cunning. It's funny. It's iconic, because it shows that Inanna doesn't take power by brute force. She takes it by being smarter, faster, and bolder than everyone else. She's not modest. She's not tame. She's not here for anyone's comfort. And yet she's deeply revered. Why? Because Inanna represents the wild interface between opposites, love and violence, creation and destruction, order and disruption. She's the energy that moves things forward, even when it breaks the rules. In modern terms, she's the update that crashes your old apps, but makes way for something better. She's disruptive tech in divine form. And she's everywhere in Sumerian culture. There are hymns praising her ability to smash the heads of mountains, fly across the sky as Venus, speak languages of every people, turn men into women, and women into men. Yes, you read that right. Inanna was also associated with gender fluidity. Her followers included individuals we'd now recognize as transgender or non-binary. Her priests, the Gala, often lived between genders, performing rituals of music mourning and ecstasy. She wasn't just the goddess of sex, she was the goddess of transformation. And her temple, more than sacred, it was a portal. Inside, ritual plays blurred the lines between myth and memory. Participants reenacted her descent, danced her rage, drank her wine. This wasn't religion as obedience. It was performance, a kind of spiritual theater where the boundary between mortal and divine was always thin. And still, despite her complexity, Inanna wasn't feared like some chaotic deities in other cultures. She was loved because the Sumerians understood that civilization needed disruption, that without desire, there's no creation, that without war, there's no change, that without descent, there is no return. Inanna isn't safe, but she's true. And even now, her story echoes. In myths of Persephone, in the idea of dark nights of the soul, in every tale of the bold woman who refuses to play small. So next time you feel unraveled, when everything you thought you were is stripped away, when you're standing naked in the dark, unsure what comes next, remember Inanna. She's been there. She didn't flinch, and neither will you. You're awake in the middle of the night now, not because of noise, but because of a strange sensation, a hum beneath your pillow, a flicker of movement behind your eyelids. You're not dreaming. Or, if you are, it's not your dream. Because you've stumbled into a story, not just any story, a Sumerian epic. The Sumerians didn't just invent writing, they invented literature. Not lists, not receipts, not contracts. Narrative. Stories of gods and monsters, kings and floods, friendship and grief. And none shine brighter or stranger than the tale of a man named Gilgamesh. You've heard his name before, floating through dusty textbooks or whispered in half-remembered documentaries. But let's wipe the slate clean. Because the Epic of Gilgamesh isn't just old. It's the oldest story ever written down. Older than the Iliad, older than the Bible. Older than almost everything still whispered in human memory. Let's meet the man himself, Gilgamesh, king of Uruk. 2/3 God, 1/3 man. Towering, proud, radiant. A builder of walls. A breaker of hearts. He's powerful but arrogant. So much so that the people beg the gods for help, not to destroy him, to balance him so the gods create Enkidu, a wild man, hairy primal, raised by animals, a mirror to Gilgamesh's refinement. They meet, they fight, they become brothers, and from that bond, the epic begins. They slay monsters, they insult gods, they build their names into legend. But then Enkidu dies, not in battle, not from age, but from divine punishment for killing the bull of heaven and chopping down the cedar forest, sacred places, sacred beings. And just like that, Gilgamesh, the invincible, unstoppable king, is broken. His best friend is gone, and in that shattering silence, he realizes something horrible. He will die too. So he runs, not from enemies, from mortality. He embarks on a journey to find Utnapishtim, the only human who survived the Great Flood and was granted eternal life. He crosses deserts, climbs mountains, faces scorpion men and deathly waters. Finally, he finds the old man and asks the impossible, "Tell me how to live forever." And the answer, you can't. Even Utnapishtim didn't earn immortality. It was a one-time exception, a divine glitch. But still, he offers Gilgamesh a consolation prize, a plant that restores youth. Gilgamesh takes it. Triumph, redemption. Then, a serpent steals it. Gone. All of it. All that pain, all that distance. Gone in a single flick of scales. And what does Gilgamesh do? He weeps. then walks home. But here's the miracle. When he arrives at Uruk, he doesn't curse the gods. He doesn't rage. He looks at the walls of his city, the ones he built, and says, "This is what will last. Not flesh, not fame, but legacy." That's how the epic ends. Not with victory, not with death, but with acceptance. It's a strange story, one with no happy ending, no clear moral, no guarantee of justice. But that's what makes it real. It's not a myth, it's a mirror. Gilgamesh's grief is your grief. His search for meaning is your own. His failure, it's familiar. And here's where the story gets even weirder. You're not just reading the oldest epic, you're living in its ripples, because so many modern myths echo this tale. A hero loses someone. They set out on a journey. They face trials. They seek immortality. They find something else instead. Sound like The Lord of the Rings, The Matrix, every Pixar movie ever. That's Gilgamesh, still coded into our storytelling DNA. Even the flood myth, so central to Utnapishtim's backstory, shows up everywhere. Noah, Deucalion, Manu, Atrahasis, all retellings of the same event, a divine flood meant to reset humanity. But the Sumerians were the first to write it down, to archive their fear of drowning, to record the moment when the world ended and restarted. So when we say Sumer gave us writing, we're not just talking about squiggles on clay. We're talking about the first human confession, the first time someone looked around and said, "We die, we love, we grieve, and maybe we remember." And that remembering, that's the real immortality. The clay tablets of Gilgamesh were buried, lost, burned, forgotten, then dug up thousands of years later. And the words, still there. That's the spell. That's the victory. Not living forever. Being read forever. So next time you feel small in the night, when the stars are silent and your breath feels too loud, know that someone else long ago felt the same and wrote it down. For you, you're sitting at the edge of something ancient, dust in your palms, wind in your hair, the ruins of Ur behind you like a forgotten skyline. And as the light begins to fade, you ask the one question the Sumerians never stopped asking. Where did we come from? This wasn't idle curiosity for them. It was a cosmic necessity, because the world they lived in, the floods, the laws, the dreams, the ziggurats, the endless cycle of birth and dust only made sense if they could locate themselves in a story that stretched back to the very beginning. And so they wrote one, a tale told in fragments scattered across tablets, whispered in temple halls, preserved in syllables so old they crack when translated. The Sumerian creation myth, not one story, but many. Woven like reeds into a mat that only shows its full shape when viewed from above. Let's start with Namu. She is the beginning, the primeval sea, the eternal waters, not a god with a throne and a beard, but everything and nothing. From her emerged and the sky, and Kai the earth. Together, they birthed Enlil the wind, who would one day separate them, pushing sky upward and earth downward to create space for life. Already, we're in poetic territory. Creation isn't war, it's separation, a gentle division, a drawing of lines. And into that space, the gods were born, dozens of them, each with a domain, a duty, a schedule. But soon, they grew tired. Too much work, too many rituals to manage, too many temples to maintain. So Enki, god of wisdom, mischief, and freshwater, proposed a solution. Create humans, not as companions, as laborers. Let's not romanticize this. We were made from clay, possibly mixed with the blood of a slain god, depending on the version, and animated not with love, but with utility. We were designed to dig canals, tend fields, cook meals, write records, serve. And for a while that was enough. The gods rested. The temples thrived. The barley grew tall. But humans are never content with just functioning. We ask questions. We make music. We fall in love. We write stories. And so inevitably we upset the balance. In one myth, humanity becomes too noisy. Our prayers, our arguments, our late-night songs drift upward, disturbing the slumber of Enlil. So he decides to silence us with a flood, a total reset. You know the story, though. You may know it by another name, but the Sumerian version is older. In it, Ziusudra is warned by Enki, secretly, quietly, against the wishes of the divine council. He builds a boat. He survives, and after the waters recede, he offers sacrifice, not out of gratitude, but out of responsibility. He reboots the system, and in return, he is granted life in a distant, silent paradise. Not immortality, just peace. That's the heart of Sumerian creation myths. Not triumph, not heroism, but maintenance. We weren't made to conquer. We were made to balance the equation, to keep the water flowing, the offerings burning, the fields breathing, and maybe, if we're lucky, to be remembered. So what do we do with that? We modern people, armed with satellites and smartphones, standing so far from Ziggurats, we can't even see the outline. We listen, because buried inside those old clay tablets is a warning. You are powerful, but not permanent. You can build, but not forever. You are part of the machine, not its master. And if that feels humbling, good. It's supposed to. The Sumerians didn't write creation myths to make themselves feel special. They wrote them to remember their place. They knew that cities rise, rivers shift, empires crack. Even gods fade, but stories remain. Especially when they're carved in clay. Especially when they're passed from scribe to student temple to temple century to century. And now, they're passed to you. You the midnight wanderer. You the accidental archaeologist of thought. You who've followed this thread through floods, dreams, temples, and tombs. You've walked in sandals through dust and data. You've climbed the ziggurat. You've descended to Ker. And now you're here, at the beginning, where it all started, where a woman stood at a riverbank, shaped clay with her hands and told her child, "The gods made us from this, so we tend it." So, we remember. The last embers of night flicker across the plains of Sumer. The ziggurats are shadows now. The reeds whisper in the canals. Somewhere, a rooster crows, and a scribe wakes his hands, still stained with clay from yesterday's tablet. You've reached the end of this journey, but the Sumerians, they never stopped writing. And maybe that's the strangest, most moving thing of all. Because for a civilization that vanished, their words have never stopped speaking. Even now, thousands of years later, you can still hear them. Not in chants, not in breath, but in code. Because to the Sumerians, writing wasn't language, it was power. Let's trace it back one last time. They began with tokens, simple shapes to track grain sheep and silver. Then, they pressed those shapes into clay envelopes bully and marked the outside. Then they said, what if we skip the tokens? What if we just write the symbols? And so cuneiform was born. Wedge-shaped signs pressed into soft clay with a reed stylus. Hard to master, easy to preserve. That was the trade-off. Ink fades, stone cracks, but clay waits. And what did they write? Everything. Contracts, laws, hymns, letters, prayers, epic poems, recipes, geometry problems, medical diagnoses, love spells. They didn't write about life. They wrote life itself. On tablet after tablet, neatly stacked in temple libraries, wrapped in clay envelopes, archived in rooms, cooled by mud brick insulation. You can still see them today. in museums, in university basements, in locked drawers beneath fluorescent lights, and sometimes in fields unearthed by accident, by erosion, by looters. Each one a message in a bottle, except they weren't sent across oceans. They were sent across time. And what's astonishing is how modern some of these messages feel. A student grumbles about school. The teacher hit me today because I couldn't recite my lesson. A lover sends a gift with a note. I send you this garment. May it warm you in the night. A merchant warns his partner. The barley shipment is delayed. Beware the dishonest agents at the docks. They sound like emails, like texts, like human beings, because that's what they are. The people of Sumer weren't abstract. They were you. They were accountants and poets, soldiers and dreamers, parents and pranksters. They fell in love, got stomach aches, lost arguments, cried at funerals, and they wrote it all down, not because they thought it would last, but because writing was the ritual. To write something was to make it real, to preserve order, to appease the gods, to leave a fingerprint behind. And those fingerprints, they've survived earthquakes, floods, fires, conquest, and time itself. They speak from a world without iron, without paper, without glass, but not without wisdom. One of the last tablets ever found in Uruk reads, "I have built the wall. I have planted the tree. I have sung the song. May it not be forgotten." It's not grand. It's not arrogant. It's a wish, the same wish that pulses through every bedtime story, every lullaby, every dusty library shelf. Let me be remembered, and you've done that tonight. You've remembered them. You've walked through their stories. You've heard their prayers. You've felt the weight of their fears and the flicker of their hope. And now you carry something they couldn't imagine, a voice in the dark that still listens. So what do you do with it? You don't have to build a ziggurat, or learn cuneiform, or make sacrifices to Inana under the next full moon. All you have to do is remember that we are old, that we are temporary, that our stories are what last. You can be a king or a priest, a dreamer or a cook. But if you write something down, if you tell your truth, it might just survive. So tonight, maybe light a candle, draw something in the dirt, whisper someone's name who hasn't been spoken in a long time. Because the Sumerians knew something most people forget. That silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the absence of remembrance. And now, because of you, they are not silent. You wake slowly now, floating somewhere between memory and myth. The scent of burning incense lingers in your mind. A flash of reeds, a shimmer of bronze, a whisper in a language older than vowels. But before we close the gate completely, there's one last door to open. Not a temple, not a tomb, a library. And not just any library, the library of Ashurbanipal. Yes, we're technically stepping out of Sumer, now a few centuries forward, into Assyria. But what was buried there, what was stored in clay boxes and burnt in conquest and sifted from rubble, the entire legacy of Sumer, the oldest cuneiform tablets we know today, most were found not in Sumerian ruins, but in Nineveh, in this royal library, assembled by a king who believed knowledge was as powerful as armies. Ashurbanipal, an Assyrian monarch, collected everything: omen spells, epics, treaties, rituals. He wanted to preserve the entire universe of ancient Mesopotamian thought. And in doing so, he preserved the Sumerians. His scribes copied their myths onto clay, sometimes preserving tablets already ancient in their time. Some tablets were broken, others smudged. But what mattered was preservation. They didn't care if every line was perfect. They cared that something survived. And when the library was sacked by invading armies, when the flames rose and walls crumbled, the tablets endured. Why? Because they were made of clay. Fire didn't destroy them, it baked them, accidentally making them permanent. Think about that. Ashurbanipal's library, designed to preserve power, failed in its political goal, but it succeeded in its cultural mission. And the irony? It was a library designed to keep information secret. Many texts weren't meant for public consumption. They were locked away, encoded, inscribed with warnings like, "He who reveals this tablet shall be cursed." But time doesn't care about curses. The tablets surfaced anyway, and now they sit in museum drawers, behind glass, inside digital archives, scattered across continents, whispering, still alive. And among them, you'll find the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Descent of Inana, the Sumerian king list, hymns to Enlil, star maps, brewing instructions, lists of exotic animals. You'll even find letters from students. Some ask their teachers for forgiveness. Others complain about classmates. One reads, "My hand is tired. The tablet is heavy. The signs are many." Same, but here's the kicker. The vast majority of tablets we've found aren't about gods or kings. They're administrative. Tax records, grain counts, worker logs, shipment notes. And at first glance, that seems boring, until you realize that's real life. The Sumerians didn't preserve only glory, they preserved routine, which means they understood something profound, that the sacred isn't just in temples or myths. It's in calendars, receipts, grocery lists scratched into clay, because someday someone might read them and understand that you lived, that you worked, that you hoped the barley shipment would arrive on time. That's the power of record keeping. It's not control, it's continuity. The Sumerians didn't believe the world would last. They believed their words might. And they were right. So maybe the most sacred place in ancient Mesopotamia wasn't the temple or the palace. Maybe it was the archive. Dark, dusty, quiet, guarded not by lions, but by silence. And if you listen closely, you can still hear a student chanting, a priest murmuring, a clerk counting, and in the back, a scribe bent over a tablet whispering, "This one's for the future. May it not be forgotten." And here you are, part of that future, reading, remembering, listening. You've entered the archive. You've heard the voices. You've become the scribe. So what will you write? What will you record? What will you pass on in your own clay? Your own symbols? Your own voice? Because that's how memory works. Not as a flame, but as a relay, passed hand to hand, line to line, tablet to tablet. And now from them to you, the lights are low now. The winds of Mesopotamia have stilled. The ziggurats, the temples, the statues, they're quiet ruins beneath the dust of centuries. You've walked their streets, read their laws, memorized their myths. But before we leave, before you drift fully into sleep, there's one final thing the Sumerians would have insisted on. A blessing, not the kind with incense and choirs, but something far older. Something simple. Something spoken just loud enough that the world might remember your name. Because after all the gods and kings, after the star charts and flood tales, the Sumerians believed in one enduring truth. Speech shapes reality. They built a whole civilization on it. So before the last tablet is sealed, let's speak once more. Let's revisit what they gave us, not as a museum tour, but as a map back to ourselves. Start with the ziggurat, those great step towers rising into the sky like stone prayers. They weren't tombs. They weren't monuments. They were connectors between heaven and earth, between gods and people, between chaos and order. You've climbed them metaphorically all through this journey. Each layer of history, like another, stare upward. Then there's the law, Not perfect, not fair, but structured. The Code of Ur-Nammu. The first attempt to say, here is how we live together. Here is how we settle what's broken. Here is the consequence of forgetting we belong to each other. Sound familiar? It should. You carry that idea every time you stop at a red light sign, a contract, or agree to disagree. Now look at the writing. A stylus in wet clay. A wedge here, a curve there. So easily smudged. So impossibly lasting. The Sumerians didn't just record history. They created a language of permanence. They didn't know your name, but they wrote to you anyway. And when you read their tablets, you don't just learn, you inherit. Then we have the temples. Oh, those temples. Not churches, not sanctuaries, but machines for divine alignment. Run with precision, managed with accounting. Rituals and bread song and silence. They weren't passive spaces. They were active systems. The Sumerians didn't wait for the gods to bless them. They invited them, fed them, clothed them. And in return, the crops grew, the rivers flowed, the contracts held. And let's not forget Inana, the goddess of war and love, chaos and creativity. Her myths weren't just about her. They were about us. About descent and return. About losing everything and still emerging fierce and new. She didn't stay in heaven. She came down. She changed. She returned, wiser. Isn't that what we all hope for? And through it all, the canals, the counting boards, the looms, the lamentations ran a single thread. Balance. That was their secret. The Sumerians didn't seek perfection. They sought stability. Each god had a domain. Each priest had a task. Each field had a measurement. Each soul had a place. And if that balance slipped, they corrected. Rituals, offerings, writing it down again, always writing it down. Because when the world tilted, the best thing to do was reach for clay and intention. So what does that mean for you? You in a modern bed far from the Tigris and Euphrates. It means that even now, when you try to order your life, to plan your week, to say a prayer, to forgive someone, to remember a name, you are practicing Sumerian magic. You are honoring the world by naming it. You are saying, let this be known. And more importantly, let this be remembered. Because that's what the Sumerians wanted most. Not to be worshipped, not to be forgiven, to be remembered. So tonight, in the soft hush between waking and sleep, maybe you whisper a name, not a god's name, not a king's name, but your own. Say it gently. Say it like clay. Say it like something sacred might answer back. And if the stars are kind, maybe a scribe will one day find your words tucked into some forgotten drawer and whisper them once more. They lived. They loved. They wondered where we came from. They wrote it down. And because of that, they were never truly gone.